Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Silver Fanfics, back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Reincarnates is All for One. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. 2 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 4 days, 23 hours, 18 minutes and 43 seconds, give or take the amount of time he spent asleep and lost track of his counting. Factoring in that information, it was reasonable to assume that he may have skipped over a month or two in his count, but he was beyond caring at this point. In any case, he'd spent roughly that amount of time imprisoned here, restrained in this infernal chair. It wasn't even comfortable. Izuku had a lot of time on his restrained hands to think about random subjects, from the sciences to philosophical debate, but eventually even those trains of thought had reached their destination and he was forced to ponder others to occupy the time. Namely, random bullshit that didn't matter at all in the grand scheme of things. If Izuku was being honest with himself, and he was forcing himself to do that a lot more in the vain hope that whatever God saw fit to deliver unto him this punishment would forgive him should he atone for whatever it was he had done wrong. Currently, the best guess for his sin was how dishonest he had been with everyone, even if he told himself it was for a good reason. Protecting All Might. Wait, he got distracted again. He was thinking about the chair. Yes, he loathed this chair. Right. He got distracted again. If he was being honest with himself, he'd prefer being stuck inside those plastic things bolted to the desks back in Class 1A. The one he was currently strapped into had no padding, no arch support, no ergonomics, and was the very definition of brutalist architecture in chair format. Ugh, Class 1A. Izuku shook his head to dispel the intrusive thoughts, doing his best to disregard his past life. The medical mask on his face pumping oxygen into his damaged lungs slid uncomfortably around scarred skin as he did so. Simultaneously, the barrels of 6 different ceiling-mounted machine guns adjusted their aim ever so slightly, zeroing in on his head and chest as they subtly shifted around. Still, he felt assured that they wouldn't fire. So long as he didn't activate any quirks, nothing would happen. He learned that the hard way mere minutes after he first woke up in the body of All for One. It was really drilled into his skull what would occur when his new super regeneration quirk kicked in immediately after he was shot, causing every gun in the vicinity to unleash holy hellfire on the undying corpse sitting in the chair. It took a manual override from the control room situated off to his right to force the firing to stop, and even then, he was subjected to painful electrical shocks until he fell unconscious. All of that just so the damned doctors of this facility could come and reconnect his battered body to that accursed life support machine. Perhaps the worst part of this whole situation was that no one spoke to him beyond demanding he respond to the doctor that stopped by occasionally to ask questions about his health. Even when he was being fed by an attendant, he wasn't talked to, nor were his words acknowledged. Izuku was no stranger to social isolation. His childhood was practically filled with nothing but that in between getting yelled at and burned by Kaken, but even then, he had his mother to chat with at the end of the day. His lifeboat. Here, he had nothing. Of course, he tried to talk after the doctors were done strapping him back in a bullet-hole-free straitjacket and explained the situation to them. How he had stupidly thrown himself into oncoming traffic to save the life of a little girl whose ball had rolled away from her onto the street, pushing her clear and taking the impact himself. How he was actually Izuku Midoriya, aspiring hero and all-might fanatic. How bringing down any one member of faculty from UA to just hear him out would clear up this misunderstanding. And they could work on a plan for fixing the situation he found himself in. The first week of his constant pleading, he was reminded with an automated message that prisoners should not speak unless spoken to. The second week, guards started loudly demanding over the intercom that he shut up and take his punishment like a man. On the third week, those assigned to guard him had enough and forced the mounted guns to fire on the restrained figure. And he spent 10 agonizing minutes in hell as super regeneration kicked in, repairing all the damage he suffered at the cost of forcing the quirk-activated guns to keep firing. He'd never felt so glad when the high-voltage electric shocks knocked him unconscious. That was the last time anyone had talked to him beyond barking orders, when the warden announced an annoyed and clearly insincere apology for his staff's behavior over the intercom, assuring Izuku that they would be going through a mandatory 10-minute corrective training course. He could practically hear the sneer in his apology. Unlike when he had broken his bones intentionally while still getting used to One for All, Izuku decided to actually take a lesson from the literal torture he'd suffered through in what he termed the third week and shut the hell up. All of this meant that for the last, what was it now? It had probably been at least 10 minutes since his last count. Yeah, that sounded about right. All of this meant that for the last 2 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 4 days, 23 hours, 28 minutes and 39 seconds, he had been imprisoned in Tartarus, unmoving and unspeaking unless directed to. Since he couldn't do much else, Izuku spent much of his time pondering the one whose body his consciousness now resided inside and explored every nook and cranny of its mind. What remained of All for One seemed fragmented though. At least, that's the best way Izuku could explain it. It was as if Izuku had moved into a new house and the previous owner left behind some of his furniture and personal belongings. As much as he wanted to deny it, he admitted there was a 99% chance that there was a not-so-subtle difference between the Izuku who had thrown himself in front of the truck and the Izuku currently strapped into this angular, blocky excuse for a chair. Cementos probably would have created something more comfortable for God's sake. Wait, no, he was getting distracted again. What was he? Yes, his mental shifts. It was like the insides of All for One had been scooped out and replaced with Izuku, and the remaining outer layer of the villain had combined with its new innards. The thought that All for One was entirely whole, buried deep inside his mind and just waiting to escape flashed through his mind yet again. But whenever he tried to search for the villain inside his head, he found mostly nothing. Something approaching emptiness. Izuku could and at one point had distanced himself from the mental leftovers of the villain. But after the third week, he gave up. His mental state had been in a worse place than that time All Might told him to give up, and he honestly couldn't find any sort of reason to live. He had nothing to look forward to, after all. When he was a kid, he could comfort himself with his dream of being a hero, but in Tartarus, there was no future, just whatever restraint system you happened to be strapped into. After that third week, Izuku reached out and touched those mental remnants of All for One with the explicit purpose of hoping the villain would reassert control over the body and kill off Midoriya's consciousness. Wait, no. After that third week, Izuku reached out and touched those mental remnants of All for One just to see what would happen. An experiment, really. All Izuku learned was that if All for One was actually hiding out in this body still, he was doing a damn good job of it. A second thing he learned was that if he reached out and touched those mental remnants of All for One, he got a sort of perspective shift. Those bits would jump out and wrap around himself like a coat, coloring his every thought. Basically, it merged Izuku's own mind with what was left of All for One, and he would think differently as a result. It frightened him a bit on some days, but at the same time, Izuku could never bring himself to let go of the security. It was quite literally the only thing Izuku had to comfort him, and as such he never really stopped using it. He wasn't entirely sure if he could at this point, nor did he particularly want to. While he didn't always like the roads his new thoughts went down sometimes, the benefits of All for One's superior mental stability outweighed some darker aspects that occasionally flitted across his consciousness. Again, it didn't transform him into an entirely different person, but it certainly provided a major personality shift. His first clue that was true came from the fact that he was readily swearing like a sailor at every available opportunity. Because while before the worst thing he'd uttered in his previous life was a single shit whilst fighting villains, now he could potentially rival Bakugo with how many fucks he threw about like candy. The second clue came when he tried to analyze the events leading up to his consciousness swap, and how he had saved the little girl. Or at least, Izuku hoped he saved her. Yeah, he saved her from the semi-truck. That much he could remember before everything went dark, but the little girl was still on the road. He only pushed her away from the immediate threat. Still, he liked to think that his bloodied corpse frightened enough of the drivers on the road into slowing down or stopping altogether. He shook his head once more to dispel the humorous image of his classmates gazing down with tear-filled eyes as the hero wannabe Deku lay broken and bleeding in the road. No, that right there. That was exactly what those darker aspects he mentioned earlier were like. What part of his bleeding and broken corpse was funny? That was disgusting. Sighing, he forced his thoughts to go back to when he saved the child. As per usual, when he thought of the event, a new, instinctive reaction appeared. A new thought that he knew he'd not had before. Why? Why would he dive in front of the truck? If Izuku had tear ducts, he'd be crying right now, and if he had eyes, they'd be watery. As it was, all he could do was take short, shaky breaths as his damaged respiratory system shuddered. He knew the answer, because it's what a hero would do. It didn't matter what happened to him. If he could save somebody, then he would do it without hesitation, no matter the person. If Shigaraki was hanging off a ledge and about to fall, Izuku knew he'd be the first person to reach out a hand and save him. But why? This was his life now. For all the issues it brought though, all the strange, hypocritical thoughts and doubts it sowed into Izuku's skull, he still couldn't bear to part with it. The sole reason he had for even wanting to distance himself from All for One's remnants was that ever-present idea the villain was still hiding inside, waiting to reassert control over his body. The more he thought about it though, the more certain Izuku became that that wasn't the case. He was 96% sure that his old body was dead. Right before he found himself in this one, he felt, well, everything inside his old one break. His organs exploded from the force of the hit, and shattered ribs punctured anything that remained marginally functional inside his chest cavity. One of the many theories he'd come up with during his time in the chair was that he underwent a consciousness swap, not just a replacement. By that, he meant that All for One's mind had entered Izuku's body, and Izuku entered All for One's, with each side leaving behind little psychic imprints, or remnants, whatever you wanted to call them. He heard mumbling from the guards occasionally. Sometimes they even purposely left the intercom on so they could taunt him with their conversation, though any attempt to communicate back would be met with a shock. They talked about their jobs and the prisoners they watched over, and even villains that were at large and expected to be transferred to Tartarus upon their capture, but he never heard anything about Midori, or rather, his old body. Knowing All For One, he wouldn't just turn over a new leaf and try to live a normal life. He'd crawl his way back into a position of power by using Izuku's body, and would have murdered everyone at UA by now, or at the very least All Might. Plus, when the guards mentioned a while back that All Might had made a rather emotional televised statement about traffic safety, citing the death of one of his students, Izuku knew his old body was dead, and any consciousness that resided inside his body at that time had died with it. For probably the millionth time in his relatively short new life, Izuku shook his head. It was so easy to get distracted. Right, All For One hiding out in his mental skin suit that Izuku liked to wear. What's the probability? About 8%, if he had to hazard a guess. That was another thing he'd picked up. He now liked to think of things in terms of percentages, and found comfort in compartmentalizing information into handy numbers. Perhaps it was due to an intelligence-boosting quirk or something. Maybe one that allowed him to do math really well. It'd certainly explain why whenever he thought back to old math problems he'd done in the past, he readily found the answer popped into his head like he had a calculator on his person at all times. He sighed again. It really was a low point in his life when he started redoing old math tests in his head just to stave off the boredom. Couldn't they have at least given him like a TV or something? Wait, he had no eyes. Ugh, how could he keep forgetting that? There were exactly two things that prevented him from just offing himself. 1. Super regeneration. That damnable quirk seemingly had no drawback whatsoever, besides being unable to heal scarred tissue or wounds that were cauterized. Basically, the wound needed to be fresh. In any case, there was the distinct possibility that Izuku snapping his own neck by utilizing one of his many strength augmentation quirks would just result in his neck being healed. And while he had an idea of how to permanently end himself, he didn't know how he'd be able to move his arm into a position that would allow him to decapitate himself. The restraints keeping him immobilized may have looked like plain cloth and nylon, but they were as strong as steel. He could undoubtedly break out of them, but not before the guns or electric shocks immobilized him. Secondly, and more importantly, he had a new goal. While he couldn't use any one of the vast multitude of quirks housed in All For One's body due to the guns pointed at him, pain has a way of making one lose the concentration required to utilize a quirk properly. After all, he was able to sort of peruse his inventory, take stock of what he owned. Izuku sighed. He didn't own these quirks. Every single one of them beyond the original was stolen. Every single one, besides All For One. A smile came to his thin, damaged lips which he quickly crushed. It was ironic, really. The more Izuku thought about it, the more he realized that the names should have been switched around. One for All and All For One. It would have been a more apt description if their names were swapped. All Might's former quirk, One for All, contained the very souls of those who had the quirk in the past, in addition to any quirks that the users themselves had. They combined into the core of One for All, and gave its current user that incredible power. All of its previous users' quirks, for one person to use. Well, that one person being him. Anyways, apparently, that was a new thing that not even the vestiges of the previous users seemed to know about. Or rather, now that Izuku could re-examine his few interactions with them through the lens of All For One, they seemed to have had an idea but wouldn't voice it. Why, he didn't know and honestly didn't care. The quirk wasn't his anymore. It wasn't anybody's anymore, so there was no point in puzzling over something that he'd never get answers to. Meanwhile, the quirk All For One certainly had the capability of stealing quirks from others, but it could also give them to people. One single quirk that could give power to anybody. If only All For One had been a nicer person, he would have made for a great hero. Wait, he got distracted again. His head shook more, finding the ability to chuckle lightly as he imagined what the guns pointed at his head looked like as they danced with his movements. He'd have used his infrared vision quirk to actually see it, but he'd have been shot for doing so, as he had been multiple times in the past. For now, he'd just have to continue to suffer in the darkness. He sighed. Idly, he noticed he tended to do that quite a lot. Right, his goal, his new dream. The one thing he had to keep him going in this world. He didn't want to be a hero anymore. Maybe it was that little bit of All For One that was now stuck atop his consciousness. Maybe it was the deep-seated hatred he had begun to fester within himself when the guards read a letter addressed to him written by his former homeroom teacher. The one where he spelled out his complete and total disinterest in meeting with the man, in addition to the lack of caring showcased by apparently every other staff member at the school. A not at all subtle warning to never speak Izuku's name ever again, accompanied by a very nice reminder to eat healthy and exercise properly. Exercise in Tartarus amounted to the electrodes placed around his body being activated at a low voltage to keep his muscles from atrophy. plus a foul-tasting cocktail of drugs and vitamins to eat with his nutrient slop that was served in place of actual food. He didn't exactly blame Aizawa, or anyone else for that matter though. He knew what it sounded like. Still, if they had just sent down somebody, anybody at all, he might have had an opportunity to get out of here. They denied him even that. Weren't heroes supposed to help everybody, even their worst enemies? That's what being a hero was all about. Butting into things where they didn't belong if they noticed something was amiss. Still, that didn't mean he wanted to be a villain. The very thought of hurting someone, even the idea of taking someone else's quirk forcefully, it sickened him. He could never do that. With one exception, but he'd get to that later. No, he had one very simple goal and a plan for the future. Searching through his vast inventory of quirks, he'd stumbled across one he'd worked with in his past life. When he was still Deku, he'd found Surge, Ragdoll's stolen quirk. Curiously, he also understood that it wasn't the original quirk he had, but rather a copy. He didn't have access to All for One's memories beyond a few fragmented bits and pieces, and all of them were random. The fact that about 20 of them appeared to be of him eating food was testament to that. But one of the memory fragments he had was of All for One talking with his close confidant and doctor about his quirk replication procedure. He was a little confused at first. Once he got over the "please help me, I'm not All for One, really, come on guys" thing and started to just poke his quirks around, because despite the sheer number of them inside him, he felt hollow. Still did, really. His best guess was that these quirk copies, while functional, were comparable to an animatronic version of a real person. It imitated a real thing, but it wasn't the real thing, and he could feel it. Each quirk felt like it was missing something, which was why he instinctively knew that All for One was currently holding onto a carbon copy of Ragdoll's quirk, as well as his own quirk, All for One. As if that wasn't strange enough, Izuku all but knew the current holder of the original version of both of those quirks was Tamura Shigaraki, or he soon would be. Through the scraps of memories he could pick through, Izuku understood that All for One wanted Shigaraki to have his quirk and follow in his footsteps. Whether or not that had occurred yet was something that Izuku was unsure of. He didn't really get access to outside information here. Still, the guards weren't acting like the world outside was ending, so he felt confident Shigaraki wasn't in control of the power yet, and quite possibly never would be. In any case, Shigaraki wasn't his problem anymore. Was it callous to think that? Perhaps, but Izuku was tired of everything. He just wanted to wake up, go to school with his friends, and be happy. He hadn't felt happiness in a long time until he went to UA and acquired his first honest-to-goodness friends in too many years. He missed his friends. As of now, he hadn't felt happiness for 2 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 4 days, 23 hours, 34 minutes and 11 seconds. He'd take the raw deal of waking up as a quirkless weakling again too. At least then he'd get to hug his mother, tell her he loved her, and eat her katsudon once more. He missed katsudon. He smashed his skull into the back of his chair, eliciting a warning beep from the machine as the guns trained more closely on him. He knew the guards were on alert as well, intently watching his movements, but he didn't care. He just needed to forget all of that. Izuku Midoriya was dead. All that was left was whoever the fuck he currently was now, some twisted version of his old self. His goal was simple. He was going to get out of this hellhole, somehow, someway, and he was going to do one final act of good. He refused to die in this body without having helped anybody. He was going to find Ragdoll and give her back the quirk she'd had forcefully ripped out of her body so she could resume her work as a pro hero. He knew what being quirkless was like, but having a quirk all your life and then having it ripped away, it must be some kind of hell, especially when her teammates continued to operate just fine without her direct assistance. As for Izuku himself, well, he wasn't sure. A part of him was screaming for him to just end it, to kill himself. But he'd been in situations like this before. Well, not like Tartarus, but suicidal thoughts. He'd battled with them before, so he knew from experience that waiting for a new day can really change one's outlook. So, while right now he couldn't find a reason to live beyond helping Ragdoll, he did understand that he may find a new one after he completed his goal. One thing he was entirely certain of, however, is that he wasn't going to try and go back to his old life. Izuku Midoriya was dead. He'd been dead for quite some time. Ignoring that little voice in the back of his head that told him nobody cared, Izuku understood that people mourned for him. His classmates, his mother, All Might. Aizawa himself probably skipped school for a few days to hide in his house. Izuku knew that the gruff man actually did care a great deal about his students. That was just it though. It wasn't fair to them. Izuku couldn't just try and step back into those bright red shoes he always wore and go about life like nothing happened. Not to mention, he was now in possession of one of the most powerful quirks in existence, and several hundred others. He was a liability, a major security risk. Even if through some magical means, the entire truth about Izuku's situation came to light, and people believed it, it wouldn't matter. He was a walking nightmare on legs, and all his friends, no. All his former friends' hands would be tied on the matter. No amount of rep with All Might or UA would prevent Izuku from just being thrown back in Tartarus or some other similar prison for safety reason. And to be honest, Izuku understood. Truly, he knew the man whose body he now inhabited. Plus, with the possibility that All for One was still lurking somewhere in the depths of his mind, he could potentially be a ticking time bomb. Coincidentally, time bomb that was another quirk that Izuku understood he possessed. It was one he had filed under a mental cabinet labeled useless because the quirk activated upon his death and would cause all of his organs to swell with blood and then explode. Not even in a destructive blast either. They'd just swell and burst pathetically, unlikely to even rupture through his dermal layer. Why All for One ever decided he needed to steal that quirk from somebody, Izuku didn't understand. It was, however, nice that All for One seemed to come with the ability to have a basic understanding of how to utilize any quirks that were stolen with it. Izuku shook his head again. He kept getting distracted. Right, life after succeeding with his goal. To recap, didn't want to be a hero, was never going to be a villain in this life or the next, and wasn't entirely sure he wanted to kill himself. That left one last option he could think of, and it seemed pretty appealing to him. Just running away, going off and living the life he seemed destined for at birth, that of a nobody. Not that he was saying being a nobody was bad, mind you, but just being your average citizen. Didn't get in trouble with the law, maybe had a family, and never accomplished anything noteworthy in life. That sounded quite appealing to Izuku right about now. A family was something he hardly gave a second thought to in the past. Since he was so young, had so many goals and desires to fulfill. Now that he had literally nothing but spare time on his hands though, he often thought about the what-ifs. What could have been? What may come? Izuku liked the idea of being a dad. It sounded nice. He couldn't even remember what his own father looked like. And that hurt. All he had was the occasional phone call, not even pictures. It hurt when his mom dodged the question of whether or not Izuku could be a hero without a quirk. He wouldn't make those same mistakes. If his son or daughter happened to be quirkless and still wanted to be a great hero, well, who was Izuku to deny them that wish? After all, he had a literal arsenal of quirks they could freely pick and choose from. He could probably give them multiple ones if they really wanted. The idea of suicide receded farther and farther back in Izuku's mind as he imagined a life where he had someone he loved at his side, and a beautiful child or two between them. Perhaps it was the social isolation and borderline torture he was going through that brought out all these thoughts. But the idea of family, the inseparable bond of blood and love, he wanted it more than he'd ever wanted to be a hero. Well, maybe not more than his previous desire to be a hero, but that was in a past life. The world had moved on from Izuku Midoriya, and it was time he moved on too. The only thing standing between him and Ragdoll, and by extension his eventual quiet life after helping her, was several thousand tons of steel-reinforced concrete, armed guards, automated defense systems, and his crippling injuries that literally kept him more restrained than the actual physical restraints to this worthless excuse of a chair. The life support monitors rapidly beeped as his heart rate skyrocketed and he momentarily lost his cool, thrashing about in a desperate bid to achieve any modicum of comfort on the slab. Prisoner 5687, cease your actions at once. Maybe if you fucks invested any money at all into, I don't know, GODDAMNED pillows, I might consider calming down. He screamed, devoid of any emotion beyond blind rage. His voice, deep and hollow with scratchy undertones, resonated throughout the cell he called his room. Izuku missed his old voice. He was rewarded for his actions with several painful electric shocks. He didn't care anymore though, continuing to cackle madly as his body convulsed. It almost hurt more, all the tubes and wires jammed into his throat being jostled around by his rancorous laughter, not to mention his lungs failing to intake the necessary amount of air for his actions. Surprisingly, after 10 or so more seconds, the electricity actually cut off. Code Lavender. Understood, Sir Wilby. Izuku managed to make out the sounds of several chairs being rapidly shoved to the side and boots trundling out of the observation room, likely leaving just a skeleton crew behind the observation window. Code Lavender. Izuku believed that to be code used when a prisoner was being difficult to move from room to room and presented an escape risk. He was quite thankful that the guards decided to give each other a pop quiz on protocols about a year back with the intercom on. It gave him quite a bit of information on what all of the code phrases meant. Taking a deep breath, or as deep as he could without hurting his damaged lungs and throat, Izuku managed to calm himself down a bit once he realized no guards were going to rush into the room to beat him up or anything. That hadn't happened yet, actually, though they could be liberal with their automated firearm usage. Their electricity bill must be pretty high too. He chuckled at that, a small pitiful chuckle that hurt his ragged and abused throat and made the blood in the back of his esophagus churn about, but he chuckled all the same. He was going to escape this place, even with the risk of All for One waiting for exactly that to happen. He knew he should care, but he really didn't have it in him to think about others right now. He needed to be out of this god-forsaken place. He'd actually conjured up some pretty grandiose escape plans that had been thought out thoroughly and down to the last detail. He always skipped a single step though: how to initiate them. He knew exactly how to escape as soon as he was able to exit the room he was currently in. He could probably even squeeze out of here riddled with bullets, assuming he was freed from this chair. That was just it though. He couldn't get past the first stage of the game. Ugh, now he was sounding like Tamura. He was going to disregard the information for now, however, and just go over what he'd do assuming he wasn't tied to the chair. Nearly a year prior, he'd purposely thrashed around until the wires in his neck fell out and his ventilator ceased functioning. Before the shocks knocked him out so the medics could re-enter and plug him back in, he noticed something. He could still breathe. It hurt like hell, and he knew he wouldn't be able to keep it up forever like that, but he could still breathe. He wagered he could force himself to do that for about 5 minutes before it became too much for his body, and then he'd need external assistance in the form of an advanced respirator. At first, he figured he'd break free and meander his way towards the nearest medical station and force one of the doctors to jury-rig up some sort of breathing apparatus to keep him steady. Or perhaps bust out of the prison altogether and make a beeline for the closest hospital he could find and demand treatment. Eventually, though, he remembered something. Kai Chisaki was imprisoned in Tartarus. He'd seen the news report. Chisaki was found screaming on the highway and missing both hands, unable to use his quirk, the handiwork of Tamura. But he still possessed it. His quirk was still in him. It's just that his quirk factor, his hands, were gone, leaving him unable to activate it. If Izuku could get out of this room, he'd be able to find Kai. How? Quite simply. He'd warp the man right to him. All Might had told him about the warping quirk utilized by All For One on Kakin after he was kidnapped by the League of Villains, where he vomited a foul-smelling black liquid and was teleported away. If the quirk sensing guns all around him were turned off, he'd be able to activate Ragdoll's power, locate Kai with literal ease, and then warp his body right in front of him. He'd steal that child-harming bastard's quirk and then use it to heal himself. He'd seen Kai use his abilities to fix damage to his own body and those of others, and he'd painfully sat through some of Eri's therapy sessions in a show of support while she described how Kai would rip her apart molecule by molecule and then piece her back together as if nothing had happened. Just because the damage was healed didn't mean the pain being vivisected was any less excruciating. Once he got a hold of Kai's quirk, he'd be able to repair all the damage that this body had acquired and then GTFO, assuming he didn't pass out from the pain of using it on himself. Well, he'd GTFO right after tearing Kai's body apart a few times and piecing him back together. No, he'd fix him. He'd give him back the hands he lost to Tamura on the highway. Right after he stole his precious quirk from him. It'd be the perfect torture. He'd have the tools to utilize his quirk back, and he'd be unable to do anything at all with it. Then again, why couldn't he tear Kai apart, put him back together, and then return his hands? Yes, that was good. He'd make sure he suffered for what he did to Sir Night-Eye, Mirio, and Eri. He really was thinking like All For One now, wasn't he? Honestly though, he didn't care. Yes. Gook. Sputtering, Izuku hacked up a small amount of blood as his emotions continued to get the best of him. Hey, at least he was acting more like All Might now. It was practically that man's hobby to spit up blood. Izuku couldn't stifle the chuckle his dark thoughts caused, nor could he stop the consequence of said chuckle, namely the tube he noticed falling out of his neck. That probably wasn't good. Any second now the shocks would come though, and the doctors would have him hooked back into his life support system so he could get back to his fantasizing. At least, that's what should have happened. Instead, well, the rapid beeping on the heart monitor was probably a good sign of how Izuku was feeling. While Izuku couldn't see it, the lights in his room shut down, and beyond the dull thud of his heartbeat, he could swear he heard the sound of all the ceiling-mounted machine guns suddenly going slack, banging their chassis against the wall as they powered down. Deciding he really didn't have anything to lose beyond suffering a bit more pain, he took a risk and activated his infrared vision. Deep blues, bright yellows, clear greens, and burning reds filled up his vision as the quirk quickly kicked in. The heat emitted from the objects changing the colors he saw. And quite simply, red meant hot, blue meant cool. He was able to easily distinguish everything in the room, and could perceive the depth, distance, and the size, shape of everything as well. Honestly, it was exceptionally close to what normal eyesight looked like, just with thermal imaging layered atop it. Hey, Izuku wasn't about to look a gift quirk in the mouth. Another great thing Izuku had noticed. He wasn't getting shot. He wasn't being shocked. He could faintly hear the sounds of panic from the guards coming through the glass of the observation window. But this was it. He could fulfill his goal if he acted now. If he channeled his inner All For One and was truly ruthless, he would try his best not to kill or harm anyone. But he was getting out of here. Tonight. Oh, and Kai was the exception to his self-imposed rules. Sorry, not sorry, Chisaki, he rasped, before putting his plan into motion. Izuku quickly activated one of the quirks he had seen All for One utilizing against All Might in his final battle, spear-like bones. Izuku barely gave a passing thought to spear-like bones as they protruded through the skin on his arms, and was pleasantly surprised to find that they didn't hurt him at all as they exited his skin. The flaw in his plan was soon discovered, however, as Izuku realized he couldn't exactly cut his way out of the exceptionally strong straitjacket with his immobile limbs. He did succeed in making 2 holes in the side of his straitjacket, though. Canceling the quirk, he rapidly applied 2 separate strength enhancers through his body, grinning as he felt his muscles bulge and tighten a bit in response. Well, he supposed one last callback wouldn't hurt too much, right? One last hurrah, as it was, just like All Might said. He whispered to the empty room, clench her butt cheeks and yell, "SMAASH." Izuku's arms easily broke free of the jacket. The X-shaped keypad buckling him into the chair flew off as well, smashing against the farthest wall and crumbling into various mechanical bits and circuitry. While standing up after not having moved one's legs much for over 2 years may have been difficult for others, Izuku's strength enhancers thankfully augmented the minuscule muscles that remained behind in the limbs. What all of this really meant, though, was that Izuku had no issue at all with standing up and kicking that infernal chair directly through the observation window where a skeleton crew of 2 guards cowered away in the corner from the deadly force. Now freed from his restraints, Izuku didn't even feel pain when the tubes were ripped from his throat, so great was his excitement. He had no time to get distracted, though. Those guns could come online at any time. Glancing behind him, he vetoed the idea of punching his way through the likely locked vault-like door that served as the entrance to his cell. It wasn't that Izuku felt he couldn't do it, but he was already feeling a bit tired from how he had exerted himself. He needed to get somewhere without the automated turrets, so he could warp Kai to him and heal himself. Turning back to the now smashed widow of the observation room, Izuku ignored the burning in his lungs and throat as he vaulted over the shattered glass, not bothering to cover his hands. He just let super regeneration heal the deep cut his palm suffered from grabbing onto the jagged material as he bypassed the terrified guards and opened the door that was the staff entrance. Time seemed to freeze as soon as he stepped into the somewhat narrow hallway that connected all the observation rooms to one another. On either side, Tartarus guards froze in fear at the scarred figure of All for One panting heavily in the middle of their walkway, unsure of how to proceed. Their hesitancy allowed Izuku all the time he needed to apply spring-like limbs to himself, before pointing his open palms up and down the hallway. BWOOM. Izuku found himself unable to keep the smile from his face as he activated All for One's favorite quirk, air cannons, watching through his thermal vision as everyone in the hallway was blown respectably far off their feet and, more importantly, away from Izuku's position. Additionally, any doors that happened to be open in the hall as well found themselves slammed shut or ripped off their very hinges. Because he hadn't applied as many quirks to himself as All for One had in the Kamino ward, it wasn't nearly the destructive typhoon that the cameras had recorded in his fight against All Might. But it was still a force to be reckoned with. He'd just need to hide inside one of these rooms for a moment to complete his plan. Taking a few steps to the left, he entered the observation room next to his own and slammed the door shut, quickly jamming an office chair that was unlucky enough to be next to him under the door handle to buy himself a bit more time. By now, he could hear panic all over the place. He was pretty sure that the way the entire building seemed to shake and the flickering lights above him meant that there were plenty of other criminals loose. Plus, he could hear the prison guards panicking out there in the hallway, loudly debating on entering the room or waiting for armored support before proceeding. The loud alarm blaring over the prison's intercom system also clued him in. Izuku frowned as he finally noticed the single guard that was still in the room, slowly reaching for the gun on his waist. There were always complications in his life. Black spots danced around the edges of his thermal vision as breathing became more and more torturous with each passing second. But Izuku still managed to whisper out. His voice was more akin to sandpaper than anything else at this point. "Touch that, and your quirk is mine." It seemed like something All for One might say, in any case. Even if it wasn't, it certainly had the effect he wanted as the trembling man's hands suddenly shot up directly in the air, a clear sign of surrender. Izuku approached and disarmed the guard, readying himself to toss the gun into the corner of the room. A quizzical look crossed what remained of his face right before he did, though. Shrugging, Izuku activated another quirk he had made a note of, hot hands, and turned his palm into a biological smelter. The gun rapidly became red-hot in the face of such astonishing temperatures, quickly turning to metal sludge. The mortified look on the guard's face was all the reward Izuku needed to know his plan had worked. He wasn't going to be trying anything heroic. Turning off all non-essential quirks, meaning everything beyond a single strength enhancer to keep his legs stable, he activated Ragdoll's search. Perhaps it was because he had fought the villain before and met him in person, but Kai's presence was rapidly located. In fact, it was the first person he sensed. Actually, there was an 87% certainty that Search was locating those he had previously interacted with in the past, because after that, he zeroed in on Muscular, Moonfish, and the presence of someone young, whom he somehow instinctively knew to be named Mustard, from the attack on the training camp all those months ago. He chuckled, the horrible raspy sound emanating from his throat failing to convey any form of amusement to the horrified prison guard held captive in the room with him. Perhaps villains needed to stop picking names that started with the letter M. They didn't seem to be having a good track record here. Izuku was just going to ignore the fact that he sensed the hero-killer stain in Kurogiri moments later. It'd have ruined the small amount of humor he found in the situation. Shaking his head, Izuku focused in on Kai's location, activating his terrible warping quirk. It wasn't quite like Kurogiri's warp gate, in that it could only bring people to and from the quirk's user. Still though, it was all Izuku needed. He sensed that a puddle of exceptionally dark blue liquid pooled on the floor in front of him, which meant that the stuff must have produced next to no heat. As the pool transformed into a large pillar of goo, he noticed a struggling red and green form thrashing about inside the mixture, tainting the deep blue with shades of color as the struggling transferred enough energy into the liquid to signify a temperature change. The sludge eventually disappeared altogether, leaving behind the lithe form of Kai Chisaki grasping at his neck with the stubs where his hands used to be. It was hard to make out with his infrared vision, but Izuku thought he could see the splotches on his skin where Kai was beginning to develop hives. Izuku scoffed at the coughing germaphobe, desperately trying to take in a satisfactory breath of air. Back, all for one. The former villain managed to hack out, his eyes staring at the sunken splotches of scarred skin where Izuku's eyes used to be, or where they were all for one's eyes used to be. Izuku shook his head as he placed his hand on Chisaki's head. He didn't have time for this. It was getting harder and harder to breathe by the second. Don't touch. Arkic, me, he cried, but it was far too late. For just a second, Izuku felt pity, felt that what he was about to do was beyond cruel. But then he remembered what Kai had subjected Iri to, and what he had done to Sir Night-Eye and Mirio. The rest was surprisingly easy, pulling on that mental trigger that constituted the quirk of all for one. Izuku felt a surge of power go through his hand on Kai's forehead. He noticed that in his infrared vision, his hand actually dropped its temperature for a few moments before rapidly heating back up to one of the deepest reds he'd ever seen. Arrgh. Izuku barely heard Kai's scream of agony as his dreadful quirk was removed from the murderer's body. He was so in awe of the power he felt coursing through his veins and eventually his entire body, while it only lasted about 3 to 5 seconds. He'd not felt a rush of power like that since he'd last used full cowl in his old life. He really wanted to slow down, to have the time necessary to process everything that was going on, what he was doing, if it was worth it, but he didn't have time. It was almost impossible for Izuku to get a satisfactory breath anymore, and he heard talk of hostages from the hallway, no doubt meaning they were already discussing strategies to bust the door down and take him out. He could feel it inside him, Chisaki's quirk, that terrible power of his, overhaul. It really was a shame Chisaki turned out to be a horrible person. His quirk was exceptionally versatile. It doesn't matter, he croaked, turning his own hand on himself and placing it upon his damaged throat. Izuku would make sure to put Kai's quirk to good use. That man, he didn't deserve such power. Thanks to All for One's capability of having a basic grasp of the quirks he stole, Izuku was already mentally preparing himself for the task of repairing his damaged body. Izuku hoped his lack of knowledge in the field of biology wasn't going to impede him in his task, as that would mean he'd need to resort to Plan B. Plan A was to simply work on repairing his lungs, using overhaul to fix the damage like how Kai was able to heal himself and his subordinates with his power. However, All for One's quirk informed him that his hypothesis about overhaul was correct. Kai could manipulate and change matter, not create it. Seems the law of conservation of mass held up even under the physics, logic-defying reality of quirks. Izuku could not create a new lung out of thin air. It was his hope to use other parts of his flesh to fix the damaged bits, and let super regeneration cover up any damage he accrued from cannibalizing himself for the job. Plan B piggybacked off super regeneration as well, but Izuku wasn't keen to try it, as he'd been all too aware of throughout his entire stay at Tartarus. He was coughing up blood. Even the doctors couldn't stop him from doing it. His lungs were just broken, much like All Might's. That meant there was an open wound in his chest, which, by extension, meant super regeneration wasn't functioning correctly where his lungs were concerned. Sure, it couldn't heal scarred tissue, but scarred tissue didn't bleed. Scars were what formed when the body healed. Something in his chest was just wrong, and Izuku was very afraid that it was the organs themselves. If he ripped out his lungs, there was a 50-50 chance that he'd either grow a brand new pair of perfectly functional ones, or he'd totally ruin his chances of, well, living. Honestly, it was even less than a 50-50 chance. All for One had super regeneration for several years, and a damn doctor at his side nearly 24/7. Super regeneration was fast, but not impossible to get around. There were certainly speed-enhancing quirks and surgical tools that could be used to get around the regeneration factor. Izuku highly doubted that the intellectual powerhouse that was Dr. Kyudai Garaki hadn't considered the idea of just using super regeneration to grow a brand new pair of lungs before, which meant for whatever reason, the idea had been considered and promptly discarded. If All for One wasn't willing to do it, Izuku certainly wasn't keen on figuring out why, since All for One's health problems were now his health problems. It was particularly odd when the quirk kicked in. It was like his thermal vision was switched off and he found himself in a blackened void, surrounded by nothing but grayscale representations of the object he was working on. In this case, it was himself. He wasn't going to look a gift horse in a mouth though. He was concerned that he wouldn't be able to see his work properly with thermal vision being a major limiting factor, but the grayscale removed that issue. The smile on his face grew a small bit as his hands operated with the skill of a dozen surgeons, pulling the skin of his chest away with near-practiced ease, pushing apart the muscle fibers, ribs, and other organs that blocked the path to his lungs. By the time he'd reached his destination, Izuku was able to determine that they were rather pitiful lungs. They looked blackened, veiny, and more closely resembled something he'd seen in those anti-smoking PSAs his middle school forced him to watch during health class. Each passing second chipped away at his resolve as the already daunting task he'd set out to do became all the harder. Izuku shook his head and was thankful that overhaul slowed down his perception of time. He didn't have to focus on his near inability to breathe right now and could just focus on the task at hand. If ever there was a time to go plus ultra, it was now. All Might always said that it was important to think about quirk usage in an easy-to-understand manner, and back when he was wielding one for all, he went for the egg in the microwave, desperately trying not to make the egg explode. In this case, the quirk overhaul was like HRM. Yes, this was exactly like playing with Legos. Every molecule was a brick. And while he didn't have an instruction manual to follow to piece things back together, he could see his lungs looked crooked. With a literal flick of his fingers, he cracked one of his lungs open like a walnut and blanched at the severely damaged structures inside. His damn trachea looked like it had been set on fire, and he believed the correct term was bronchi were pitiful, as were the alveoli they connected to. Of all the things Izuku hadn't expected to happen today, struggling to remember his anatomy classes wasn't one of them. In any case, most of those internal structures were, much like the flesh of his lungs, blackened and shriveled. With quite literally desperate energy, he started tearing the damaged and clearly non-functioning structures apart, looking for any sort of usable material. Underneath all the blackened gunk was gray gunk, which Izuku hoped was viable tissue. What looked like healthy parts of his lung were grayish, so the young man hoped this was a close enough situation. Izuku's respect and disgust for Kai increased yet again. His knowledge of the human body must have been unparalleled. The former Greenette easily acknowledged that the man could have been a scientist at Island with his intelligence. Something Izuku already privately suspected was the case back when he was rescuing Eri from his clutches. The former Yakuza boss was the head researcher in his own personal laboratory, and while his methods were unnecessarily cruel and sloppy in the name of efficiency, he still developed quirk erasing bullets by somehow managing to devise a method of not only activating someone's quirk from cells that had been removed from the original host's body, and then somehow shoved that technology inside a fucking bullet. That knowledge only made Midoriya hate the man all the more. Izuku continued to rip all the gray chunks away, setting them off to the side, before very carefully taking apart what was clearly a healthy bronchi and alveoli. He studied their structures, looking at how all the molecules seemed to fit together like the Lego bricks they were, and after he felt confident enough, he slowly started assembling all those gray chunks he'd set aside earlier into mostly perfect replicas of the healthy parts he'd observed. To the outside observer, his hands were moving faster than a speeding bullet as blood sprayed out of his chest. To Izuku, he was building his own Lego set, doing his best to make it look nice and neat. 2 seconds had passed in the real world, but it felt more like 5 hours to Izuku. Thankfully, he'd yet to feel any pain, but he knew that as soon as he stopped using overhaul, his nervous system would kick in and it'd be a struggle to just remain conscious. He had managed to assemble the Lego house that was his lungs, and in what he would consider a semi-decent manner. Quite frankly, he was rather disheartened by the final product, but it was the best he could do. By his own estimates, he'd removed, very nearly, 43% of his lungs, considering they were already shrunken and damaged before he started his task. That meant he'd removed a little less than half of what remained of his lungs. He didn't need to be a mathematician to know that wasn't good, by any definition of the word. On the bright side, what was left consisted only of totally healthy or partially healthy tissue. Anything that looked like it could squeeze out even a molecule of oxygen. Izuku kept. All the remaining necrotic tissue that resembled charcoal more than anything else was lumped into squishy, disgusting ball of flesh and blood floating in front of Izuku, which he was perfectly content to let drop to the floor to be forever forgotten. He was quite certain he'd be breathing better than he was before. The only question was, would better be enough? Only one way to find out, really. The former greenette grabbed the ribs he'd removed from his chest cavity and let float around in the void that surrounded him, clicking them back into place as easily as one would stick a magnet onto a slab of iron. His other organs were arranged in a neat fashion. The muscle fibers and skin gently laid back atop his chest like a blanket slid atop a mattress. Izuku inevitably ran into another problem because his life seemed to be one car crash after another, and his hopes of feeling any sort of decent after this impromptu surgery plummeted. His neck was, without a doubt, riddled with holes, and his esophagus felt like it was loaded with scar tissue. While Izuku could crane his neck down to peer inside his chest, he couldn't do the same thing for his throat. While he had a rubbery limbs quirk that he could utilize to stretch himself around like Mr. Fantastic to acquire the correct angle, he wasn't entirely sure how well that would translate with his wounds, nor how that might impact his surgery. Hell, he wasn't even sure he'd be able to fix himself with a mirror if he had one, because that was diving into the mechanics of how his vision worked with this weird grayscale overhaul provided. Was this simply piggybacking off of his thermal vision quirk, or was overhaul providing him with an entirely separate method of vision? If it was just piggybacking off thermal, he wouldn't be able to utilize a mirror in any way, shape, or form. Gritting his teeth, Izuku realized he'd need to do a patch job of some sort if he wanted his work to have any effect. So he tore himself open and fumbled around with his hands to search for any issues in lieu of visual confirmation. If he felt rough scar tissue, he tore it off and smoothed it over with nearby flesh like he was spreading butter onto a slice of bread. Holes, he treated much the same. He could only hope the flesh he was cannibalizing for the job wasn't too important in its original position. This was seriously cutting into his chances of actually making it out of here. But Izuku mustered up the willpower and resolved to do the best job he possibly could, even when he was performing his own surgery blind. He needed to get out of Tartarus. He unequivocally refused to get back in that chair. If a guard stood between him and freedom, he wasn't sure the guard would be walking out of that situation alive. With that in mind, he resigned himself and figured that he'd done the best job he could considering his limitations. Izuku folded the skin of his esophagus and neck back over before canceling out overhaul, only to immediately collapse onto his knees, fighting to remain conscious as mind-numbing agony coursed through his entire body. Searing, startling, blinding white-hot pain flooded his every thought as the skin upon his chest flew off his muscle. Before those two were tossed callously out into the side, ribs popped right out of his chest while his lungs exploded and then imploded immediately afterwards in a matter of seconds as everything else painfully reassembled itself to a state of perfection. Just as quickly as that pain appeared, it ended. Izuku had suffered from a condition known as sciatica in his old body, wherein the muscles in his leg would occasionally squeeze down, crush, or otherwise rub the sciatic nerve that ran down one's leg, even though said nerve was not meant to be crushed or squeezed down upon. The end result was an exceptionally painful sensation, actually rivaling that of when he broke his bones. The thing about sciatica, though, was that the pain was instantaneous and didn't linger. It was pure agony for the split second when he felt it, but then it'd go away just as quickly, not even a hint of tenderness or soreness left behind. Of course, it'd return as soon as the muscles clamped down on the nerve, but the blinding pain was there and gone in a flash. That was exactly what using overhaul on himself felt like, suffering on an immense scale. For but a few seconds, his nerve endings were torn apart, and then pieced back together as if nothing was wrong. He felt far better than he had before he used the quirk. And while the pain was definitely seared into his memory, his chest felt considerably better off than it had before. He wasn't quite able to tell if there was any pain through the mental aftershocks that had him reeling. But for the first time in 2 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 4 days, 23 hours, 51 minutes and 8 seconds, Izuku took a fairly painless breath of fresh, non-machine supplied air. It seemed that he wasn't able to take a very deep breath, but again, he was still breathing under his own power without too much issue now. He could, without a doubt, work with this. The smile that graced his face was probably thin and crooked, but it was made with genuine happiness. Forcing himself back onto shaky legs, Izuku's infrared vision noticed the guard's hands, once raised in the air, had flown to his mouth and were poorly holding back a spray of liquid that spouted out around his fingers. His eyes seemed to be focused on a greenish-orange, rapidly deforming ball on the floor in front of Izuku. But then again, it was hard to tell which way he was looking in thermal vision. The guard promptly decided to punch out from his shift in the waking world. As his body slumped over and he promptly slid out of his chair, face first into the aforementioned ball. That ball was probably all the bits of his discarded lungs, now that he thought about it. Actually, no, he didn't want to think about it, because then he might want to vomit too. In an act of mercy, Izuku rolled the guard off the lump of discarded necrotic flesh with his foot, before turning his attention back to Chisaki's still twitching form. It was time for Izuku to escape. He'd just used Chisaki's quirk to make a tunnel underground and bail through there. As a bonus, he could even use Overhaul to erase any evidence of his tunnel having existed as soon as he was done using it. Truly, the power to manipulate matter itself was a frightening one. It was too bad Chisaki seemed content to just build massive spikes to impale people with. He could have been a powerful doctor or an infallible sculptor with a gift like this, not to mention all the possibilities of what he could have done as a hero. Izuku felt something bubbling up inside him. The unbridled yet normally suppressed rage he felt as Izuku stitched together with the calculating coldness and tendency to gloat of all for one. Words came spilling out of his mouth before he even thought of saying them. I never, thought I'd say this, but I must. But I must thank you, Kai Chisaki. You squandered your gift when you used it to torture Eri, and killed anyone who stood in your way. Now though, I see you for what you actually are. You were simply a vessel designed for the explicit purpose of ferrying me this wonderful quirk, weren't you? Izuku said, his voice much clearer than it had previously been. It still wasn't what Izuku would consider healthy, but it was better than his previous 80-year-old smoker voice. He was struggling to breathe around his words, but he was still doing it. It'd suffice for now. His musings were cut off by the, all for one, we know you're in there. Release the hostage and surrender yourself peacefully. No one has to get hurt. It's impossible to break out of Tartarus. By that, Izuku smacked his head to focus his mind. He was running out of time. He was equal parts relieved and disappointed that he wouldn't have the time he wanted to torture Kai for everything he put Eri through, but he had a prison to escape from. Still, he'd be leaving Chisaki with a parting gift. Right, yeah, how about no? I'm way too young to die. To die in prison. Well, technically speaking anyway. I suppose it's not. It's, not. Izuku realized the issue before it became one, and smacked himself upside the head to stop his mumbling before it progressed any further. He didn't have time for that. Not to mention his habitual motormyth wasn't exactly compatible with his new inability to properly breathe. Quickly, he bent down and touched Chisaki, activating Overhaul. Unfortunately, there wasn't much left of his hands that could be reassembled into appendages. In fact, there wasn't anything left, which meant Izuku had absolutely no idea on what to do. He wasn't about to overhaul himself again just to see what the internal musculature of a hand was supposed to be like. And he wasn't sure Kai would appreciate Izuku cannibalizing other parts of his body to acquire the necessary amounts of bone and flesh to remake them. Growling, Izuku was forced to concede that stealing, liberating Overhaul from him would have to suffice for revenge. Punishment. Well, actually, no it didn't. There was always Plan C, after all. Thinking quickly, Izuku ripped apart the man's ribs much like he did his own, reaching down into his chest cavity and parting everything haphazardly as he reached for the man's lungs. Like the sharpest scalpel in existence, his fingers parted the flesh of Kai's organ and spread one wide open, his perfectly healthy bronchioles and alveoli fully visible in Overhaul's strange grayscale. It was tempting, oh so tempting, just to reach in and grab several handfuls of the stuff, just so he could rip himself apart again and stick Kai's healthy bits inside his own chest. The sole reason he didn't was because at the very last second, when his other hand had reached down to peel back his own chest, Izuku recalled several old biology lessons about organ transplants. In addition to the fact that Izuku wasn't sure what his new blood type was compared to Kai, and he didn't feel like learning why doctors only gave blood transfusions to people with compatible types, there was the very real chance that his body would reject anything he removed from Chisaki and put inside himself, which would only compound his current issues. He might not have been as healed as he'd hoped to be, but he was still standing and could breathe without assistance. Again, it'd have to do for now. Reluctantly, Izuku closed the man back up with the bare minimum of care he could muster. But he was about 99% sure everything was back in the correct place. All right, 98% sure. Snapping out of Overhaul's grayscale was, again, jarring, and he couldn't hold back the coughing fit it sent him into, nor the flecks of blood he spat up from the action. It seemed that Izuku's exploratory surgery had woken up the former Yakuza leader, but the former Granette paid him little mind. Welcome back to the waking world, my friend, he wheezed, feeling what he hoped was saliva and not blood start to trickle out the corner of his mouth and down his chin. Unfortunately, the pain he felt in his throat and the coppery taste in his mouth discounted that idea. This is my punishment for you. That quirk, the ability to manipulate molecules themselves. It's not your anymore. You don't deserve it. Do your best to recognize that this is what you get for torturing Eri and killing Sir Nightai. Sheesh, talk about a broken record. Izuku wasn't entirely sure Kai heard any of his rant. Either way, he had bigger problems to contend with, namely, a lack of oxygen. As the knocking on the door grew louder, Izuku barely held onto consciousness as he crouched down to the tiled floor, struggling to take in not-so-deep gasps of air. He literally almost mumbled his way into unconsciousness this time. If the flickering of his thermal vision was any sort of indication, which was, well, he'd say it was an issue. But he was instead going to look on the bright side and treat it as motivation to get a move on. The flickering dissipated after a few seconds, so with renewed vigor, the marginally healthier man touched the floor with his hand and activated his appropriated quirk. As soon as Izuku did, a hole appeared in the ground and swallowed him whole, not unlike something from those old Looney Tunes shows. The door was finally kicked down and several heavily armored riot guards charged into the room, guns and quirks blazing, only to witness the gaping hole before them vanish in front of their very eyes, turning itself into a jagged mess of crisscrossing spikes that denied any and all entry into the escape route. A screaming, twitching, and hive-covered Kaijisaki, a passed-out guard covered in what appeared to be blood and necrotic entrails, plus a circular section of spiked, untiled floor were all that remained in the room besides the similarly confused guards. Everyone shared looks with each other, unsure of how to proceed but silently acknowledging the facts at hand. All for one had escaped Tartarus after nearly 3 years in captivity. For Izuku, though, he knew the truth in that moment. All for one was gone. For the most part, Izuku had escaped Tartarus exactly 2 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, 5 days, 0 hours, 1 minute and 4 seconds after waking up in the body of Japan's most notorious villain. It was time to find Ragdoll. Izuku continued to burrow through the ground at a leisurely pace, unfortunately not because he felt invincible, but because he was still having trouble with his breathing and felt like he might pass out if he pushed himself too much. Still, he did feel assured that no one was following behind him with, like, a tunneling quirk. He had hastily constructed a series of crisscrossing spikes to block off his initial escape route in truly Kai-esque fashion, but it worked. After his initial panic spiking, however, he took the time necessary to properly reconstruct the matter he shoveled out of the way. The room he escaped from once had a simple, black-tiled flooring. If he took his time with reconstruction, he could have easily left the room in pristine condition and reassembled the tiles along the way out. He now understood why Kai relied so heavily on spikes when he fought, as they were perhaps the easiest thing to construct. The action of forming spikes was equitable to grabbing a fistful of sand and hurling it at someone's eyes. All Izuku had to do was grab and pull, and the spikes formed on command. It was reasonable to assume that eventually heroes would attempt to drill through his spikes to follow Izuku's trail. So he was digging out small chunks of earth, moving forward, then turning around and reassembling it back to the state he found it in. Kai was simply so keen to use spikes in his battles because they were one of the fastest things he could construct, keeping with the flow of battle. Technically, Kai could spend hours in his grayscale representation of the world building up a veritable fortress with which to defend himself, but that would have snapped him out of a battle-ready state. Not to mention time still moved, albeit slowly, while he worked. He used spikes because it was quick, efficient, and got the job done. Overhaul was almost like a speed quirk in that regard. The quirk slowed Izuku's sense of time to the point of a turtle's crawl while accelerating his own bodily functions, which mostly just meant allowing him great speed with which he could use to construct matter. It took only about 5 or so seconds by Izuku's own estimation to build those spikes, but actually reassembling everything in a manner that closely resembled what he had previously destroyed took far, far longer. After spending close to an entire hour reassembling the first section of dirt he removed, he came to an epiphany. Dirt didn't exactly have a shape. He didn't need to assemble it in a way that looked exactly how he left it. He just needed to make it look like it hadn't been overhauled by himself. It still took about 10 minutes of his personal conception of time to assemble things back into a manner that looked natural, especially so whenever he ran into pipes or shells he felt a compulsion to reassemble perfectly. Seems his borderline OCD tendencies had stuck around from his old life. Ugh, he'd have to start up his quirk analysis notebooks again, and he'd probably be spending page upon page writing about all the quirks now residing in himself. He would readily admit he enjoyed Overhaul quite a bit. All for One's favorite quirk had been air cannons, largely because it was a quirk limited only by the user itself. The quirk on its own worked by expelling gusts of strong wind from the palm of its user's hand, but the strength of the blast was limited by the physical capabilities of its user to withstand the recoil caused by it. So, for example, if Izuku owned that quirk before he was trained by All Might, the gusts of wind he could create would be relatively pitiful, as his body would automatically limit the amount of power he could output. Consequently, his blasts would have increased in strength after All Might had trained him and he gained some actual muscle for once. The sole reason air cannons were such a destructive force in All for One's hands was due to the sheer number of other quirks he combined with it to make his body able to withstand the generated knockback. Izuku had things other than pure destruction on his mind, however, which was why air cannons wasn't at the top of his quirk list. For Izuku, Overhaul was the perfect all-around quirk, able to fulfill nearly any role he could imagine. It could be used offensively, defensively, and even had the capability to heal. He could go toe-to-toe with combat-based villains one day, and then be hailed as an amazing rescue hero the next for performing several surgeries in the middle of a disaster zone. Painful surgeries, but still, he knew Ochako was rubbing off on him in his old life when he kept thinking of being her partner in the hero business. Her, the talented rescue hero, and him, the personal protection muscle. Then again, Ochako kicked his ass several ways to Sunday in combat training when students weren't allowed to use their quirks. So she probably didn't require as much protection as Izuku would have liked. He shook his head to dispel thoughts of the round-faced beauty. His chances with that were long gone. That had continued to be one of his biggest regrets, never telling her how he actually felt. He was far too scared of ruining their friendship to ever consider confessing. Not to mention the overwhelming fear of just disappointing her. She could never like Izuku. He was just Izuku. Pathetic, weak, only had friends of any sort because of a quirk that wasn't even his own. If All Might hadn't given that to him, he'd still be living with his mother and probably working a low-paying job for the rest of his life. Quirkless people always had it rough in the job market, even for jobs that didn't remotely require quirks. Why hire the quirkless kid to work the cash register when you could hire the guy who could adjust the height of his own body at will? The one with the quirk was far more interesting. Man, Kaken would be pissed if he could see Izuku right now. He was positively livid when Izuku first exhibited All Might's quirk, now that he had several hundred inside him. Well, he'd probably explode in rage. More so than usual, anyways. No. That life was over. Stop thinking about the past, you damn Deku. He chastised himself, fighting back yet another cough and patching up a section of dirt and gravel with his new quirk. Turning around, his hands rapidly disassembled more terrain and he momentarily paused when he came upon a concrete wall after shoving the dirt molecules aside like they weighed nothing. A house foundation, perhaps. It was a man-made wall, that was for certain, but what was on the other side? Canceling out Overhaul, he found himself puzzled by the obstacle in front of him. It would take little to no effort to move it aside with Overhaul. Anything he touched became like wet paper for Izuku to mold into anything he desired. But he didn't know what was on the other side. What if the wall was flimsy? It was underground, so it had the potential to be a foundation for a building. What if this was the only good foundation? And Overhaul would compromise the structural integrity of whatever was on the other side. Or, what if it was filled with water or something? Izuku didn't exactly fancy drowning, though he did have quirks to combat that now that his lungs were functional. But he didn't know if Overhaul would work on or when surrounded by water. Quirks had been cancelled out by stranger things. Perhaps being surrounded by a liquid would impair his ability to mold the molecules of whatever he touched. It was also incredibly hard to see down here. Everything was pretty cool, temperature-wise, so it was all nearly the same exact shade of blue, and it was only through the utilization of Overhaul's grayscale representation of the world that he was actually able to discern that he was moving forward, and vague outlines of the things he was assembling, disassembling. If only he had eyes. He'd overhaul his head to assemble some functioning eyeballs. But he didn't think he could do that due to multiple issues. The sole reason he was able to fix his lungs was because though they were damaged, some parts of it still function. Izuku could literally see what the alveoli and bronchioles inside him looked like, and simply rearranged the molecules of his lung cells around to make structures that looked exactly like those did. Even if that was a non-issue, he still wouldn't be able to see properly. It'd be the issue with his throat all over again. He'd need like a mirror or something. Or would he? Hands touched the scarred visage he now called his own face, tracing over the spots where his nose should be and the hollowed skin pockets that covered his eye socket. Perhaps it may work. Worst comes to worst, it'd just be a small momentary pain that super regeneration took care of with ease, and at best, his problem was solved. Nodding to himself, Izuku got to work. Super regeneration was unable to heal wounds that were scarred over or cauterized. It blocked the healing process, so Izuku took that knowledge to its logical conclusion. The scarring literally blocked the healing process and didn't outright cancel it. It was like a traffic jam on the road, stopping cars from going forward. If Izuku removed the blockade, super regeneration should theoretically kick in and heal the wounds. Plus, if he was wrong in his hypothesis, super regeneration would just grow the scarred tissue back over his face. To test it out, Izuku overhauled just a small portion of his new face, right where his nose should be. It was the work of a moment to simply peel the skin off of his skull. And though he knew it had hurt, he wanted to give super regeneration the most amount of healthy tissue to work with. Basically, he scraped away far deeper than just the topmost layer of his skin, peeling away and discarding most of the tissue until he had almost reached his skull. Resigning himself, Izuku deactivated Overhaul. His teeth grit in frustration as he felt a large chunk of his flesh straight up ripped from his skull, grimacing at the pain. Surprisingly, it wasn't the worst thing he ever felt, but it still wasn't pleasant. Even through the pain, though, he found himself smiling as super regeneration activated, and he felt a new protrusion and cartilage form upon his face. Within seconds, the fleshy mass humans called a nose had finally formed upon the face of All for One, and Izuku felt the stirrings of a second emotion he'd not experienced in quite some time: satisfaction. He rapidly tore away the rest of his face with abandon, peeling off the entire top layer of his scarred head and face, quite literally exposing the skull around his eye sockets, as there wasn't much flesh to start with in the first place. The holes that were still present on the sides of his head where his ears used to be had the scar tissue removed from the area, and Izuku ripped off the remaining damaged skin that trailed down to the back of his neck. If he could see his head, he knew it'd look like someone had tortured him, with his visible sinews and skull glistening with fresh blood. But he didn't care. Even the pain he was about to experience wouldn't hold a candle to the sheer elation of his discovery. Hell, he wanted to go out and find someone with a pain-killing quirk just so he could rearrange his face however he wanted without pain. Actually, he did have a pain-killing quirk, but he only had the capability of directing it onto someone right in front of him for a few minutes at a time, and it couldn't be used upon himself. Maybe if he found someone with a pain-killing quirk that worked on themselves, he could propose a quirk swap. That's not a bad idea, he mumbled, even as his flesh bubbled and expanded around his bleeding and exposed skull. He may literally be able to give himself plastic surgery to look like, well, however he wanted. He may even be able to mold his body into an appearance identical to his old body. Even though the chance was small, it was something he'd ponder later. He could undoubtedly give himself back his old appearance, but the real question was, would super regeneration accept the new position of his molecules, or would it attempt to rearrange himself back into the original shape of All for One? He supposed it depended on what activated super regeneration. Was it physical damage, or anything that altered the form of its user's body? By the time he finished his thoughts, he didn't feel any more of the throbbing pain that encompassed his entire head. Super regeneration had finished its job, whatever that happened to be. Turning off infrared vision, he found himself in total darkness. With a cough, Izuku berated himself. "You're in an enclosed cave, dipshit. Of course you can't see anything." Shaking his head in shame, he activated hot hands. The lips on his face that were once only slightly upturned at the corners bloomed into a full-on, toothy grin as he finally saw the wrinkles on his new palms, glowing red and white from the heat radiating off his extremities. He flipped his hands around, in total awe of the sight of his fingernails, the minuscule amount of hair on his arms, the blood-soaked white prison jumpsuit and tattered remains of the straitjacket he wore, all cast in the orange glow of light coming from his hands. He was quite thankful it was his blood that soaked through the fabric, idly remembering a bit of it spraying out of him while he ripped his chest apart back in the prison. He just kind of assumed that the blood would stay inside his chest for some reason, even as he literally ripped things out of it without a care in the world. While he was definitely in pain, it wasn't unbearable and he didn't feel lightheaded. Couldn't be that bad. There were more important things to think about. Now, he could keep moving forward with his plans since he had functioning eyeballs again. Izuku had a new goal before he found Ragdoll though: find a mirror. He was pretty desperate to see if his face looked normal. Right, stay focused. No time to get distracted. All for One had several quirks that were rendered useless due to the injuries inflicted upon him by All Might, such as quirks that increased the amount of time he could hold his breath, ocular quirks that allowed him to see through any material as much or as little as he desired, one that turned his eyes into what amounted to flashlights, and even a quirk that allowed him to bend his previously non-existent earlobes as much as he wanted. He cocked a recently formed eyebrow at the thought, activating the eyelights quirk in addition to the largely unimportant earlobe quirk, and started questioning reality as he bore witness to his earlobes dancing and shaking around in front of his vision while he twisted them around like unbaked pretzel dough. He was a poor man's Kyoka. Man, he was really bad at this whole don't think about the past thing. Izuku shook his head and went back to the obvious question at hand. At what point did All for One decide, yes, I need to steal this person's ability to manipulate their earlobes? Who does ... who does that? He asked no one in particular, his hand reaching up to rub the back of his head in confusion. He noticed there was a large quantity of hair beneath his hand, which meant that he wasn't bald anymore. Was it super regeneration that grew his hair back? Or did he unknowingly activate some sort of hair-growing quirk or something? Izuku shook his head to dispel the confusing thoughts. He had a wall to get through and breathing to focus on. Activating his now usable X-ray vision quirk, he was able to glance through to the other side of the concrete. It appeared to be the wall of a tunnel or underpass of some kind. and he could see straight through to the other side like someone had replaced the solid rock with see-through glass. There was a single, shaggy individual with a wrinkled face and a highly unkempt beard dressed in a ragged coat warming himself by a barrel with a fire lit inside it in a small, dirty tent nearby. Obviously, the man was homeless. The walls around him appeared to be covered in graffiti, and it was dark everywhere else not touched by the glow of the flame. So, either he was in some underground tunnel, or it was night outside. There wasn't a road going through the place, and it looked more like some kind of unused and abandoned footpath that had long since fallen into disrepair. He could have gone around and found another place to exit his self-made tunnel from, but he didn't really care. What hope could one homeless man have against the veritable arsenal of quirks at Izuku's fingertips? With that thought in mind, he shrugged and activated Overhaul, this time electing to remove a perfectly Izuku-shaped hole in the wall in front of him, stepping through the new opening much to the surprise of the vagrant. He now had a flair for dramatic entrances, it would seem. Could be worse, he supposed. The man eyed Izuku curiously, but didn't say anything. Additionally, he didn't appear to be scared witless, so his face must have been properly healed from his improvised plastic surgery session. "Greetings," Izuku said, bowing slightly to the ragged man across the tunnel. Hey, he may be in the body of a villain, but that didn't mean he had to be impolite. It was also nice that he didn't seem to be stuttering much anymore. His old self probably would have tripped over a simple hello. Bonus points for the confidence boost. He'd probably still have to deduct those points thanks to his new borderline sadistic tendencies. However, what you want, eh? My money. Ain't got nothing, you ruffian. If you're gonna hurt me, just get it over with then. The man barked, barely even sparing Izuku a second glance as he turned his attention back to the warming fire. The outburst actually surprised Izuku. He expected the man to turn tail and flee, and he'd be lying if he said he didn't want him to drop his wallet. Hey, he'd need money. Izuku wasn't being cruel, he was simply practicing moral relativism. Yeah, that sounded good. While money would be appreciated, I have no intention of harming you. I must inquire, however, why would you assume me to be some sort of villain? He offered the man his most reassuring smile, while spreading his arms wide in what he hoped was a welcoming manner. The man cocked an eyebrow at Izuku, staring him down. You mean aside from blood-soaked Tartarus jumpsuit? Yeah, that'd explain it. He'd need to ditch that. Could he overhaul himself some new clothes? Or maybe he could ask the man for some. And if he refused, then maybe he'd steal his. No, that was wrong. The man obviously needed them. Even by the fire he was shivering. Now that Izuku thought about it, he was shivering too. Geez, it really was cold outside tonight. Without even thinking, Izuku had approached the man's barrel and mimicked his movements, standing as close as he could to the flames with his palms outstretched in an attempt to warm himself up. He also may have stopped halfway over to lean to the side and spit a mouthful of blood onto the cracked concrete floor beneath him. Despite all that, the man merely scoffed and kept his attention directed at the source of warmth, barely paying Izuku any heed whatsoever. The former greenette found himself lost in the sight of the fire, as it was the first time he had properly seen, well, anything in quite a long time. He observed the various scrapes and spots of rust on the sides of the barrel, the little embers that floated up into the darkened tunnel from the various newspapers and twigs shoveled inside the roaring flame while he listened to the crackling of said material as it burned to ash. A minute of this uncomfortable silence passed before Izuku decided to speak once more. You're oddly calm despite being next to an escaped convict. One from Tartarus, no less. You must have a rather powerful quirk if you think it can protect you. Izuku drawled, silently disgusted with himself. That sentence came out far more threatening than he had intended it to. But he had to know. It was this desire in the back of his skull. He needed to know exactly what quirk this man had. If it piqued his interest. Well, ain't got no quirk, sir. Just myself. So why don't we stop beatin' round bush and you do what you gotta do? The way the man spoke, so resigned. It was a trip down memory lane, and an unwelcome one at that. From back in the days where Izuku would just take whatever was thrown at him because he knew that one undeniable fact about himself. He was quirkless, worthless Deku. You think you can hang with us? You know what comes next, don't ya? The small green-haired child merely nodded and hung his head, already preparing himself for the new burns and bruises he was about to receive. Still, he knew he'd find himself back at Kaken's side the next day. This was just tough love. Kaken and he were friends, Izuku knew it. He just had a different way of showing it. That didn't make the fist colliding with his face hurt any less, however. Izuku grit his teeth and let out an annoyed growl, and for the first time that night he got a reaction out of the ragged man. He flinched and looked away, in a manner all too similar to what Izuku had done as a child. He just accepted it, figured he was going to get beat and took it, because there was nothing he could do. But now, what would Izuku do? For once, he was on the opposite side of the spectrum. Do you have a phone, old man? The sigh that escaped his chapped lips ruffled the tangled and messy hair of his beard. But he nodded in resignation. His hands slowly reached into the tattered pockets of his coat and pulled out an older-looking model of phone. Its screen cracked, stained, and damaged. Izuku took the offering and flipped it on. Pleased there was no password he needed to enter and to proceed. It had about 50% of its battery left, which was more than necessary for what Izuku was going to do. He immediately clicked on the internet app and started creating a few tabs he could bounce back and forth between. He first searched up his old name, Izuku Midoriya, quickly flipping to a new tab before he could see the loaded results. He already knew exactly what it would say, but he wanted to postpone it all just a bit longer. Perhaps he could stave off the heartache he knew was coming. Secondly, he searched up the wild pussycats, hoping to find some clue as to their whereabouts. If worst came to worst, he could just go back to the location of the summer training camp and squat in their little woodland mansion until they return. It'd be shelter over his head, at least. Plus, if they came to see who was using the water and electricity after they got their monthly bills, that'd certainly speed things up. He wasn't quite sure how he was going to get Ragdoll's Quirk back into her, but he'd do it one way or another. If that method happened to be force, while she was currently quirkless, she wouldn't be able to resist him. Shaking his head at the troubling thoughts brewing inside his head, he opened another tab and searched up All Might. That tab surprised him. The first thing he saw was an article about All Might fighting a villain yesterday, and in his muscle form, too. But how? That was impossible. Izuku died with One for All inside him. The only thing All Might should have had left within him would be embers. Izuku was the new flame of One for All. He clenched his fist and tried to activate full cowling, half expecting to see the familiar green surge of electricity dance across his skin. Nothing happened though, which confirmed that the quirk didn't travel from his old body and into All for One with him. A thought did occur to Izuku, however. He quickly flipped back to the tab he had created about his former self, and felt his heart drop at the Wikipedia page he was greeted with. Izuku Midoriya was a provisionally licensed hero who studied at UA High. He didn't need to click the page to understand the rest. The presence of the word was provided more than enough information. He did his best to dispel the news he already knew but wanted so badly to deny, by focusing on his train of thought. As far as Izuku knew, his situation would be the first time that someone who previously possessed the quirk of One for All outlived the one they passed the quirk on to. Perhaps, when Izuku died, the flame of One for All transferred itself back to the only living recipient of the quirk. All Might had said all the previous users died while fighting All for One, and they simply made sure to pass the quirk down to someone else before the fight occurred. Either UAS support course had done something magical beyond helping Hatsune blow the doors off of each and every classroom in the building, or this was a highly efficient imposter. But that left the other remaining question. How much time was All Might, or this copy of All Might, working with here? He was back in his muscle form. Izuku scrolled through several other articles and saw a few video thumbnails to prove that much to himself, and he decided to work off the assumption that this was indeed All Might himself. Before he had given One for All to Izuku, he had stated that his hero time had been cut to about 3 hours thanks to his wound. And that thing definitely wasn't getting any better, plus All Might had only grown older since then. Taking all that into account, All Might had at most 2.5 hours of hero time, and at the very least 30 minutes. However, if he had passed One for All onto someone else by now, his time may be reduced substantially again. Could he pass the quirk on again? Would he have to wait for the embers within him to fully reignite into the fire? Or could he freely give it away once more? Izuku felt his hand tugging at the massive hair atop his head in frustration, and he pulled out several strands with equal parts rage and curiosity. Holding them up to the fire, he finally found out his new hair color. White. Ugh, he was old as shit now, wasn't he? Great. Izuku let the strands fall from his grasp and burn up in the flames, his eyes flickering briefly back to the ragged man beside him. He was curious and slightly apprehensive, if he had to take a guess as to the man's emotions. Obviously confused that he hadn't been murdered yet or left alone. He was clearly at a loss for what would happen next. Izuku flicked the power button on the side of the device, letting it fall into sleep mode so he could observe his reflection for the first time. The light of the fire cast enough of a glow off his face that his features reflected across the dark screen, plainly visible. He was fairly normal, thankfully. It seemed that his decision to rip all the skin off his head had worked out spectacularly, and his face was entirely healed, no more of that horrendous scar tissue he had seen back in the Camino ward. His eyes were, actually, they seemed to be green, if he could go off the dim reflection, plus his hair was fairly well maintained and gave off a bedhead but proud vibe. The white color meshed pretty well with his new features. He didn't appear old, so it must have just been its natural color. He looked to be about 35 maybe, somewhere around that age, though he knew himself to be much older due to that life force quirk he had that kept his features youthful. His nose was certainly larger than Izuku's former one had been. and it was slightly angular, but once again, it didn't look bad. He certainly could have found himself in a worse body. He would say he was ruggedly handsome. His face seemed oddly familiar though. Oh my god, it's your own face. Of course it's familiar. Izuku hoarsely shouted at himself, slapping a hand against his forehead in frustration. He ignored the homeless man's flinch at his sudden movement and continued to berate himself mentally for his idiots. The body swap teen had some of all for one's memories. Of course, seeing his own face would strike a sense of familiarity with Izuku. With a sigh, he turned the phone back on and went back to the Wild Pussycats tab, scrolling through some of the recommended articles. He frowned as he thumbed past the 5th thumbnail that showcased the team, each and every photo missing a certain wide-eyed member with long, emerald green hair. It was just Mandalay, Pixie Bob, and Tiger in all the promotional images. Izuku flipped over to the images section of the search engine and grit his teeth at the picture he saw at the bottom of the screen, tapping twice on it to bring himself directly to the website. He barely held back the curses building in his throat as he read through the article dated about 2 years ago, not too long after he found himself trapped in this new body. Former pro Ragdoll pigs out on ice cream after forced retirement. The picture itself was of an obviously distraught Ragdoll on what Izuku assumed to be the balcony of her own goddamned apartment, eating out of a pint of banana-flavored ice cream with tears rolling down her face in loosely fitting, baggy clothes. The picture was shot from down low and far away, so it was obviously some paparazzi asshat invading her privacy for the money shot. The article itself was sensationalist garbage, and he idly noticed he was reading from one of those tabloid websites that made up 99% of everything they wrote and had intentionally misleading titles. Yet he still found himself upset by the article. He knew Ragdoll had retired. The team stopped by UAS dorms to say hello and he heard the full story. He found it nice that Ragdoll was still intent on helping the team, even if she wasn't going to be doing field work anymore. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and Izuku got all the information he needed from that one. Of course, she wasn't content to lounge about an office taking calls and filing reports. She was a hero. The article mentioned the usual drabble he had barely paid heed to in his former life, all the speculation on what happened to her Quirk. There was never any public explanation for what occurred. No one wanted to admit at the time that a man was on the loose with the power to steal quirks, so they mostly just let the media speculate and spread rumors to their heart's content. It seemed that the vultures had settled for the explanation of SIQL, or stress-induced quirk loss. It happened to pros occasionally, and even regular people. Quirks were like a mental muscle after all, and going through something traumatic could damage one's ability to utilize them. It was a spectrum, and most people who suffered from it didn't lose their quirk altogether. They just lost their ability to effectively control it. Medication and therapy could help, and it seemed the paparazzi jerk who snapped that ice cream photograph had tailed Ragdoll for quite some time, showing her dressed in a hoodie, jeans, and a baseball cap in an obvious attempt to not be noticed entering a psychiatry office. The picture was accompanied by the truly illustrious caption, "Quirkless pussycat seeking counseling for trauma or eating disorder. See her shopping list below." Izuku turned the phone off after that. It wasn't like the article was horrendous slander. Compared to some of the vitriol he'd read about Midnight or even All Might those news agencies wrote, this was relatively tame. But they didn't understand what she'd suffered through and were simply making fun of her inability to live up to the high standards of pro hero. He could already tell what other websites would be calling her, even the respectable ones. Every news agency did the same thing when a pro exhibited any struggles with their quirks. Top hero Kamui Woods becoming quirkless. Watch as he fails to save child from sludge monster. New scars signaling the end of Eraserhead's career. Could the underground hero soon become quirkless? All Might's true form revealed. Former pro gives first quirkless interview. He'd read all of those before, and he knew exactly what it meant. Quirkless was another word for weak, helpless, a veritable disability in today's day and age. Someone with the power to extend their pinky toe had more value than an exact clone of that person without the quirk. Why? Because they had a quirk. Who cares what it is? A quirk's a quirk. Izuku grit his teeth and shoved the phone back towards the uneasy man standing next to him at the fire, unsure of how to proceed. He did eventually work up the courage to take the phone back and return it to his pocket. Izuku merely seethed in place for a few moments, trying to plot his next move. He resisted the urge to seek out and murder the paparazzi reporter. They were just doing their job, as scummy as it was. Murder was something Izuku thought about often, and was quite pleased with his ability to say no to the urge when it popped into his skull. Cause boy would it be easy. So easy. But Izuku wasn't all for one. He was still Izuku, just with a little extra. He'd adjust, he always did. Right, step 1, he needed clothes. There were several options to get them, and he'd figure something out. Step 2, shelter for the night. Izuku knew he had tunneled out pretty far from Tartarus, but he was still within an hour's distance of the place. There were bound to be cops and pros swarming the streets in record numbers very, very soon, if not a full-blown evacuation. Wherever he was, the prison did not seem to have a particularly good handle on the problem when Izuku tunneled out, and it was entirely possible that they wouldn't. Wherever he was now, somewhere in the Chiba prefecture most likely, would be stop number 1 for Tartarus escapees. Step 3. Reevaluate his definition of barely functioning lungs. In the back of his mind, Izuku was doing every mental exercise he possibly could to keep his heart rate up, but it'd be falling pretty soon. This was bad, because he had a numbing quirk that assisted him in ignoring pain when his heart rate was above certain level. Overhaul was sadly not the miracle cure he needed. And while he succeeded in keeping himself alive for now, he'd probably need to either risk ripping out his lungs and hope super regeneration would fix it, or get medical attention for his newish issues. The blood wasn't very concerning to Izuku. He could definitely feel where that was coming from. And that location was somewhere in his esophagus, not his lungs. Every time he coughed, he could literally feel the skin in his throat tear open, and then super regeneration would heal it right back up. When he was blindly shuffling around molecules to patch over the holes he could feel, he obviously left a patch or two of very thin skin in his wake. That was acceptable for now. The pain wasn't horrendous, and really, it was simply the inevitability of it all that grated on Izuku. It was going to tear, and he was going to have to either spit up or swallow the tiny amount of blood that he was leaking with each breath. He was joking when he said he should vomit blood more to emulate All Might. His lungs were functioning, now that he repaired some of their internal structures, at the cost of cannibalizing other parts of his own flesh to perform the deed. Now that they were smaller, his breathing wasn't as good as he'd originally hoped it would be. The situation would need to be resolved within a few days. Step 4. Find Ragdoll. Invading the woodland mansion was a viable strategy, but knowing the Pussycats, they probably kept Ragdoll close. Even though they weren't related, the 4 of them all acted like a family, so even if Ragdoll wasn't there in the new promotional images, he was 78% sure she would be nearby. If he could find out where the Pussycats were operating at this moment in time, he could get near them and use Ragdoll's own quirk to find the woman. From there, while he was shoving this quirk inside her one way or another. That sounded a lot worse than he wanted it to. But hey, how was he supposed to explain all this to the terrified woman? Hey, it's me, Izuku. I'm that 16, well, now 19-year-old kid that you talked to a tiny bit during that summer camp where you were attacked by villains and lost your quirk. And I know I kind of died about 3 years ago, but guess what? I now inhabit the body of the single most dangerous criminal in existence and want to give you back your stolen gift. So, want it back or something. Oh, and please don't tell anyone about my existence. I'm kinda trying to stay on the down low, you feel me? That wasn't even accounting for all the coughing and wheezing he'd be doing throughout the entire explanation. Izuku took a break from his musings to spare another glance at the ragged man, who was now gaping at Izuku with his mouth hanging wide open. He said all that out loud, didn't he? Old habits die hard, it seemed. You're one of them crazies, ain't ya? He asked, eyebrows cocked. Still, he made no attempts to run. Izuku merely shrugged. I'd certainly hope so. Maybe I'd wake up from this nightmare. I do hate to be a bother, but I'm going to need some clothes. The ones I have on me simply won't do for hiding out. Got spares. The man shook his head but sighed as he took off his coat and handed it over. He was about to strip off his pants before Izuku held up his palms and shook his head. I have no desire to. Desire to see whatever you've got going on under those trousers. But please, allow me to pay you for the coat. I'm certain that this can buy your silence as well. Izuku gave off his most reassuring smile. But by the way the man grimaced and averted his eyes, Izuku knew he'd need to work on it a bit. If his offer of payment sounded like a thinly veiled threat, while Izuku didn't really care, it was kind of funny, watching the man resign himself to Izuku's whims. Just get it over with. Certainly, Izuku wheezed, while snapping his fingers to draw the man's head back to attention, whereupon he quickly capitalized upon the moment to place his palm upon the man's forehead. The familiar drop in temperature and subsequent rise now accompanied by a shower of red, bioelectric sparks spraying from his entire arm. The man's eyes widened behind Izuku's hand and he gripped his wrist, trying desperately to wrench the now glowing hand away. Midoriya decided now was as good a time as any to experiment and activated the painkilling quirk he had made a note of earlier. Perhaps if he utilized all for one and painkiller at the same time, he could donate quirks to others and rip them out of some without causing the person any discomfort. It'd certainly be helpful if he were to attempt something like this in a stealthy manner. Agonized screams tended to draw unwanted attention. Izuku was pleased with the results as the man didn't appear to exhibit any pain at all, only continuing to weakly push back against the arm placed upon his forehead. In fact, the only person experiencing pain here was Izuku. He wrenched the hand away from the shaggy man's forehead, biting back the curses rapidly rising in the back of his throat as he gingerly held his now burned wrist, the flesh dripping and sizzling from the intense heat given off by the quirk he had forced into the old man. Hot hands. He didn't expect that the man would be able to activate it right away, or that he'd even know how to use it at all. Izuku hissed as he drew 2 fingers over the burned flesh, activating Overhaul and peeling away the damage so super regeneration could kick in and heal the wound. As it did so, he looked back towards the man now staring at his red-hot hands and barely contained wonder, twirling his appendages around so he could see it from all angles. Heh, didn't mother tell you not to bite the hand that feeds? Izuku managed to hack out, standing tall to face the man. Perhaps this would turn into a fight. He could easily blast the man against the wall with a simple air cannon to knock him out. But having cannon fodder, a willing ally in the coming days would be of great help. Brown eyes the size of pinpricks shot up to Izuku's green, mirth-filled orbs. It had dawned upon the man what just happened. His eyes swapped back and forth between his hands and Izuku, before he uttered a name, barely audible above the crackling of the flames. All for one, as something like that. It's a bit of a story. Perhaps you'd care to listen. Izuku gestured a hand towards the tent that the man lived inside, his intentions entirely clear. The man only dumbly nodded and lifelessly walked over to the tent, unzipping the flap that served as its entrance and beckoning the imposing form of All for One inside the cramped space. Izuku didn't exactly want to be in such close proximity to the man. But shelter was shelter, and it was good concealment if any cops came around the area. Dropping his blood-stained prison jumpsuit in the barrel fire and letting nature hide the evidence, Izuku picked up the old man's discarded jacket and threw it over his shoulders, sighing in slight relief at the warmth it brought. "What's your name, old-timer?" "Arata Haruki. Mr. All for One, sir," he stuttered out, still standing like a deer in the headlights holding open the tent flap for Izuku. He simply smiled at Haruki and took another step forward. "Please, call me Izuku. Perhaps you'll understand when I finish with my tale," he said, stepping down and into the tent. Haruki only nodded meekly and followed the villain inside, zipping the tent flap shut and keeping the cold breeze out as Izuku decided to start his story from where it all began. His death. "Tomoko, honey, are you sure you don't want to come with us?" Ryuko Tsuchikawa, aka Pixie Bob, asked her decidedly depressed friend and former partner. No, she was still her partner. Just because she wasn't an active pro hero anymore didn't detract from her connection to the team in the slightest. She was still a wild, wild pussycat, no matter what the public at large seemed to think. "Come on, it'll be fun. You and Ryuko can scope out all the hot dudes." Pixie Bob's partner in crime, Mandalay, Akashino Sasaki, spoke up, wiggling her eyebrows suggestively at the bundle of blankets and pillows all merged together to form the entity known as Tomoko Shiretoko, the former pro hero known as Ragdoll. Said bundle of blankets and pillows shook what appeared to be its head in the negative, and a thin, feminine human hand darted out from underneath the fluffy yellow covers to snag more fruit slice-shaped chocolate, an offering presented to appease the comfy beast, that were arranged neatly on a plate in front of her. The two humanoids in the room shared concerned looks with each other but didn't say anything. What could they say? Tomoko had been hit hard when she first lost her quirk and was forced to retire at the young age of 31, and after about 3 months of pure angst and depression, things got better for a little bit. Tomoko had started smiling again. She was interacting with fans, going to meet and greets, and just generally being the happy, energetic ball of fur that she always was. That lasted for a solid 5 months of time, and both active female members of the Pussycats cherished those 5 months. Tomoko seemed happy to be acting as their secretary of sorts, dealing with the press, flirting with the fanboys, doing little interviews and appearing on talk shows to promote the team, usual celebrity, pro-hero stuff. It was almost like the incident never happened, like her quirk had never been stolen. It started out slowly, but it did occur. Tomoko started receding back inside the shell she had created, blocking out the sunlight and sealing away that bubbly personality of hers. It took Tiger calling Shino and Ryuko a pair of dipshits before they finally caught on to the ugly truth they had been willingly blind towards. Tomoko had finally run out of juice. Her entire 5-month stint of happiness and joy, of things being back to the way they used to be before that fateful night at the summer training camp, had all been an act. Tomoko thought that if she simply pretended that everything was all right, it would be, and then everyone would stop fussing about her and asking if she was okay. Unfortunately for her, that's what hurt the most. Tiger was the only person who didn't fall for it, and it was thanks to his constant support that Tomoko even kept up the charade as long as she did. Shino and Ryuko were unfortunately fooled by their bubbly friend, and simply thought she was over it, that it was okay to stop worrying about her and go back to the way things were. Tomoko wasn't okay. How could she be? 1 minute she was a pro hero and the next she was some office worker filing away the fan mail addressed to the rest of the team. She was never the recipient of large quantities of fan mail despite the fact that she was the founder of the team, since she was far from the flashiest or most powerful member of the group. But as soon as she was forced off by the government due to her inability to control your quirk, the small amount of fan mail she did get dwindled down to nothing. Even reading mail addressed to the entire team felt hollow when the contents contained no mention of Ragdoll's presence, her contributions, or even her existence. The last time she even saw herself in any of the letters was from some mother thanking the team for the financial donation they made to a wildlife foundation, which was coincidentally entirely Tomoko's idea, with a request that they bring back that wide-eyed bubbly girl my son used to find funny. People couldn't even be bothered to remember her name nowadays. It was literally a Google search away. She was nothing. Tomoko hadn't realized how blind she had been for her entire life, but once her lack of a quirk locked her out of her old life, she found a new door open for it online in all the quirkless chatrooms and groups. She never knew how bad it really was out there, but now, she couldn't remain blind to the truth. Being quirkless was a disability. No one wanted to talk about it, and good luck trying to do anything noteworthy in the world if you're quirkless. Currently, the most talked about quirkless person in the entire world was Melissa Shield, the daughter of David Shield, due to her intelligence. Despite the fact that she released photographs of her foot X-rays to prove her quirklessness, people didn't buy it. The tabloids all said she had some kind of intelligence-boosting quirk, and it was a common joke to make on late-night television. People refused to believe a quirkless could do anything so advanced. That was how the world worked, though. The only consolation many quirkless people seemed to find nowadays was the sentiment that they would be one of the last generations, as they had dubbed themselves. Quirks were becoming more and more common, and quirkless people less and less. By all estimates, in another generation or 3, quirklessness would be all but gone. Until then, well, those 20% plus Tomoko would just have to suffer through a society that was more than happy to sweep unpowered individuals under the rug and ignore the problem altogether. Tomoko flinched underneath the massive fortress of blankets and pillows she had constructed around her body to hide from the world as she felt someone's arms wrap around her makeshift armor, squeezing its occupant tight. "Tiger's waiting for us outside. We're gonna have to get going for now, Tomoko. But we'll be back soon. Just think about it, Kay. I know you don't want to come to this one, but we'd really like you to come with us to the Mustafu convention on Monday, all right?" Shino pleaded, desperately hoping for any answer at all from their formerly bubbly friend. "Maybe," was the only thing Tomoko could bring herself to mumble out, popping a few of the orange-flavored chocolates in her mouth and doing her best to hold in the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Maybe all those magazines were right. Maybe she did have some kind of eating disorder. Her intake of food had definitely increased lately as she tried to bury her sorrows with anything, really. Cooking had been a great habit to pick up. It kept her mind off things. But she just had to be good at it, didn't she? Now she suddenly knew how to make all of her favorite things and was able to do it quite well. This led to many late-night katsudon binges. She wasn't fat, she was still fairly in shape, but a lot of her previous muscle definition had been lost and she'd packed on a few extra pounds, probably 10 to 15 of them. Like she said, nothing terrible. And she still liked to keep up with her workout routine, but when your hero costume shows as much skin as hers did, well, cameras could tell when you gained or lost any sort of weight. Still, it's not like she wore that costume much at all anymore. That belonged to Ragdoll, and Ragdoll died when that bastard all for one ripped her quirk right out of Tomoko's body. She still had nightmares about that horrendous pain. While she couldn't see anything beyond the fluffy yellow blanket covering her head, she did hear the apartment door closing as Shino and Ruko finally left, allowing Tomoko the chance to pop out of the covers and reach her hand down to grab more of the delicious little orange-flavored bites. She felt a twinge of sadness, but for a different reason as she bit down on the treat, letting the slight bitterness of the orange mix with the sweetness of milk chocolate. Izuku Midoriya had sent her a small care package filled with American candies and other little goodies as a get-well present after the Kamino Ward incident, along with a nice little handwritten note from All Might himself. She still liked to read that note. It was pretty hilarious how the man wrote in all capital letters. The gift basket was largely unimpressive, but Tomoko did find herself addicted to the small chocolates shaped like fruit slices, specifically the orange-flavored ones. Why, she didn't know. She just liked the flavor. She still ate them and was pleased with their taste, but she always felt sad knowing the bright-eyed boy had died in that traffic accident. He was so sweet, helping out Mandalay's nephew Kota even after such a rough introduction to him. Not to mention what he did to his own arms to save the boy. It was tragic to hear someone so young had their life cut short, she supposed. Kota was distraught all over again. It was like his parents died a second time. Izuku had promised the boy that he'd take care of himself, and then he goes ahead and throws his body in front of a semi-truck. Kota seemed to bounce back from this loss much quicker though, said he finally understood what it meant to be a hero. It meant saving others even if it had cost you your own life. She shook her head to dispel the thoughts and decided to flip on the television. Maybe she could watch one of those sappy rom-coms Ryuko seemed to be obsessed with. Grabbing the glass of water she had set aside on the table in front of her earlier, she idly flipped to the news first to see if any villains had attacked recently. The glass in her hand soon found itself on the floor, shattered much like the calm-visaged Tomoko had managed to plaster atop her face. The tears fell freely as she saw the aerial helicopter footage from the burning complex of Tartarus prison, the guards on the ground clearly struggling to contain the surge of criminals that burst forth from within even with the support of many arriving pros. She knew the newscaster was saying something with fear evident across her face, but Tomoko couldn't make it out over the deafening ringing resounding from her ears. Thankfully for her, the rolling headlines spelled out all she needed to know. Villain known as Muscular broke free from guards, succeeds in shutting power down to the entire facility. Convicts presently confirmed to have escaped include Muscular himself, the cannibal Moonfish, and All for One. All for One was free. Tomoko shrunk herself back down into the pillow fortress she had created. Chocolates abandoned on the table before her, shattered glass left unattended on the floor. She couldn't think and she could barely breathe. The damn walls themselves seemed to be closing in around her as everything just fell away into nothingness. Her mind simply went blank. Even hours later when Mandalay, Pixie Bob, and Tiger all rushed into the room worriedly, shaking and prodding Tomoko to try and get any form of reaction from her. She could do nothing but tremble between the three of them as they all hugged the former pro tightly, desperately reaching out to their friend locked inside her own thoughts. She couldn't answer their pleas though. That horrible black mask was looming over her body once again with an outstretched hand, hungering for something she didn't have. A Quirk, Eraserhead, was tired. More tired than usual, anyways. Trying to balance being a teacher, watching over a small child with the capability of erasing literally anything she touched from existence by rewinding time itself, and then adding hero work into the mix. Well, let's just say Aizawa had given up carrying his yellow sleeping bag around in favor of buying several copies and planting them at strategic locations he frequented. While the staff meeting room at UA did indeed hold a sleeping bag he'd stashed away for emergency, the cabinet where he stored the yellow bundle inside was currently smashed to smithereens, courtesy of one enraged All Might. Aizawa wished he was back to his skeletal form once more. At least then when he got angry he wouldn't accidentally break anything. The cabinet seemed to be on purpose though. The teacher had been ragged, for lack of a better term, since the death of his successor. Initially, Aizawa had simply suspected that the reason All Might seemed to pay special interest to Midoriya was due to the freckled teen being his secret love child, the byproduct of a one-night stand. After the child died in that unfortunate accident and All Might suddenly regained the ability to use his quirk, things got complicated. The teacher was all but forced to reveal the truth to UAS staff about One for All due to the development, and Aizawa was less than pleased at Toshinori's teaching habits. Still, he never yelled at the man, or even brought it up with the rekindled symbol of peace, because he mourned for his green-eyed student more than anyone else in the entire school. Even now he hadn't fully recovered, but he had snapped out of the depressed stupor the man had been trapped inside for a good 3 months. Apparently, he decided that the best way to honor his student's legacy was to continue being the symbol of peace for just a bit longer and locating another successor for the quirk. He'd apparently considered Mirio for the job, but the perpetually smiling teen refused the offer. He wanted to accept it, but he feared he wouldn't be able to use Rewind on him to restore his lost quirk if he did. As of right now, All Might still eyed Mirio for the job, but both parties were at an impasse. The symbol of peace wasn't getting any younger. He couldn't hold on to his quirk forever. As of now, his hero time limit was capped at about 2 hours a day, a noticeable decrease from when he last possessed his quirk, truly possessed it, not when he just held onto a slowly emptying pitcher of the power. The sound of a chair being crushed under the man's currently massive fist snapped Aizawa back into reality, and he subconsciously scooted himself a bit further away from his colleague. Okay, it was a very conscious decision. He wasn't keen on being near the angry man right now. The rest of the staff in the room were managing their anger in far more constructive ways. Though Snipe probably shouldn't have been whirling his gun around in the air and pacing back and forth like he did. First rule of firearms was don't point them at anyone you didn't want to shoot. Hizashi was being Hizashi, practically vibrating within his chair as he rapidly bounced back and forth between multiple tabs on his laptop to read as much news on the incident as he could. Midnight, Cementos, and Powerloader were all crowded behind the voice hero, scanning over whatever it was he had on screen at the time. Nazu and Vlad King seemed to be the only ones maintaining a semblance of calm, though the quirked animal had a slight frown on his face and Vlad King was clearly twitchy, ready at any moment for a fight. To be fair, they were expecting one. As soon as word that Tartarus had fallen reached UAS ears, everyone was set on beyond high alert, patrolling every square inch of the school's grounds and religiously guarding the dorm rooms. That was 9 hours ago. The school had finally managed to acquire a decent amount of backup, and several hired pro heroes stood guard outside, relieving the UA staff from their duties so they could finally have a proper meeting to discuss the situation rather than frantically shouting at each other through cell phones and dashing around the campus whenever they suspected something of being slightly unusual. Everyone was tired, both physically and mentally, but this discussion needed to happen. Despite the early morning light shining brightly through the windows of their conference room, everyone there wanted nothing more than to acquire a few hours of sleep. I think it's time we began a realistic assessment of the situation at hand. A cutesy yet tired voice rang out, instantly silencing the entire room. Say what you will about Nezu, he knew how to make people shut up. Personally, I find it highly unlikely though. He's alive. All eyes turned towards All Might's hulking form, his electric blue eyes staring straight into Nezu's beady black. The quirked animal gulped from the sheer intensity of his stare. The most anyone knew about the incident currently was simply whatever had been reported on the television. All for One had managed to bust out of Tartarus, thanks to the villain muscular killing power to the facility itself, shutting down all the defenses that kept the quirk thief trapped in his chair. Communications from the complex had been spotty at best, as the inmates had taken time to bust out their fellow prisoners in order to overwhelm the guards. Tartarus was too far away from Mustafa for any of the UA staff to get there in a reasonable amount of time, which meant they were forced to simply watch the aerial helicopter footage of escapees laying waste to the facility, and hope that the pro heroes who arrived on the scene would be able to retake control of the prison. It seemed like the entire complex had fallen at this point. If the video on Mike's laptop showing inmates trying to fight their way off the bridge that led onto Tartarus's artificial island was any indication, it made many of the pros cringe when they witnessed more than a few of the convicts literally fly away from the area with their quirks, and several others simply jumped off the island into the waters below. Eventually the situation would be resolved. Of that, UAS staff had no doubt, but they wondered just how many villains would manage to break free. What would be the cost here? Tartarus held Japan's most dangerous criminals. To be thrown in your quirk had to have exceptionally destructive potential, or you yourself had to be one of the most unrepentant psychopaths in existence. The room had quietly held onto the belief that All for One wouldn't survive escaping, as it was common knowledge that the man required a particularly advanced life support apparatus simply to breathe. He was kept imprisoned by those guns just as much as he was by his horrendous physical health, which was the sole reason he was not kept in a drug-induced, semi-comatose state. No one knew All for One better than All Might though, so his declaration that the man was somehow still alive sent chills down the spines of all present. The hulking figure elaborated on his reasoning when it seemed everyone was waiting for that with bated breath. If I know one thing about All for One, he wants to live. He wants to finish what he started. If he wasn't absolutely certain that he could have gotten out of there alive, he wouldn't have taken the chance to escape. He'd have continued waiting for someone to rescue him. The fact that he got away means he found some way to overcome his injuries. I suspect he may have forced some of the medical staff to recreate his helmet. All Might explained solemnly, casting his saddened gaze around the room. He may not attack right away, but he's planning something. He's gathering strength. He's either going to head straight back to Shigaraki and regroup, or he's going shopping. Almost everyone in the room leaned back at the man's declaration, no one more so than Aizawa himself. Shopping? Was All Might actually so exhausted that he couldn't think straight? Did you say Japan's most dangerous criminal is going shopping? President Mike incredulously asked, cocking an eyebrow at the man. He shrunk back into his seat when the symbol of peace stared right back into his eyes with an expression that conveyed nothing beyond complete and utter seriousness. He's going shopping. For quirks. The room paled as the implication set in, but none could deny the likelihood. If All for One couldn't get back to Shigaraki instantly, then there was no telling what he'd do along the way as he meandered back towards his protege. That man didn't care about anyone besides himself, and his cruelty knew no bounds. All Might knew him though. At this very moment in time, he could say with utmost certainty he knew exactly what that man was doing. He'd haunted those who possessed his quirk since its very inception, so he had an innate understanding of One for All's tormentor. Right now, at this very second, if he wasn't in the act of murdering someone or taking their quirk, he was about to do it. You're killing yourself, man. "Es fine." Izuku managed to mumble around his latest mouthful of blood, choosing to swallow this particular instance. He couldn't help the small smile that came to his lips, thinking about how Ashido would have been all over this situation by now making inappropriate jokes, but he was able to crush down his inability to, once again, forget the damn past. His smile must have shown teeth because Haruki physically recoiled back. The former Greenette attempted to placate his new, whatever errata was, quirk receptacle, at least. It's really a lot better than it looks, he whispered, struggling to hold back his latest cough. That statement, at least, wasn't untrue. Izuku was 99% sure the blood was coming from his throat, which, probably thanks to him spreading the already minuscule amount of flesh in that area around like jam on toast, was dangerously thin in certain places. Coughing had the unfortunate side effect of tearing that thin flesh wide open, whereupon super regeneration would kick in and grow that minuscule amount of tissue right back. At the very least, the coughing this time was different from the wet, fluid-filled hacking that used to be par for the course in Izuku's life. These coughs were barely more than poorly executed attempts at clearing his throat. Whatever he did to his esophagus, while seemingly functional, made the act of breathing somewhat ticklish. Every damn inhalation made him want to scratch his throat internally, which, 4 times out of 5, made his body cough involuntarily. Cough, tear flesh, spit blood, repeat. In a stunning display of what Izuku recognized as kindness, the homeless man seemed to weigh the value of Izuku's words, and apparently found them wanting, because the next thing he knew, his arm found itself slung around the man's dirty shoulders for support, whereupon his now considerably taller frame was hauled up off the floor of the tent he was still inside. While he protested what Arata was doing, his newfound inability to raise a hand up to brush the white hair out of his face was a solid "hey, maybe don't fight this." That wasn't going to stop him from complaining verbally, though. What are you, doing? Izuku knew what he was doing. Life force, the quirk he had that kept him alive, came with the sad side effect of limits upon his physical mobility. Running for 5 minutes to bust out of prison, then standing still and upright for maybe 30 minutes afterwards. What Izuku didn't even consider a light workout was giving him flashbacks to that day in the park all those years ago, where he finally overworked his body so much it just gave out. Despite all his previous desires and mental declarations of how he was never going to sit down in another chair for the rest of his life once he got out of Tartarus, Izuku honestly wanted nothing more than to just plant his ass on the ground and sit there to focus on his breathing. Getting yoused to a doctor, Mr. Allfur, Izuku, sir, he explained, unzipping his tent flap and almost literally dragging Izuku's dead weight out of the structure. The monumental effort the former greenette was putting into simply planting one foot in front of the other was so great that Izuku could barely find it in himself to speak. Still, he'd gotten at least halfway through his story with Arata, so he knew the important bits, which, apparently, he might need a refresher course on, because even if he didn't remember any of Izuku's story, he should have remembered the part where he got a brand new quirk, courtesy of the only man in the world who could give away quirks like that. Why, you can't take me to a doctor. I'm trying to lay low here, he complained, attempting to put up a token resistance of halting his movement, only to find the surprisingly strong homeless man supported his body without much issue. Yous look like you're about to keel over from breathin'. I'm takin' you to a free clinic. Guys, they're help homeless like me out all time. I knows you can't exactly get treated at a hospital, so this'll have to do. Whatever your goal is, it can't accomplish it if you're dead. It seemed he had forgotten their little talk. If he'd already forgotten his sole objective right now was to find Ragdoll and shove her damn quirk back inside her. The man's logic about being dead not being conducive to his goals notwithstanding, screw him. I'll be fine. His pleas were rendered rather ineffectual by the coughing fit and spray of blood that erupted from his mouth after that declaration, which Arata took in stride, kicking some dirt over the trail of red liquid Izuku was dropping behind him like breadcrumbs. Tell that doc. At the very least, it was still night, morning, whatever. The sun still wasn't quite up, though he could see the beginnings of orange light beginning to filter in over the horizon. Thankfully, the park Izuku and his wheelchair substitute seemed to currently be in was all but abandoned, beyond a few other individuals that appeared to be vagrants like Arata, who were still sleeping on various decrepit wooden benches scattered around the place. Yous just keep me coat wrapped round your jumpsuit nice and tight, and no one'll be wiser. Izuku managed to jerk his head in an appropriation of a nod. How far? About 15 minutes at this pace, sir. Well, 10, if we hurry. That was unacceptable. Just as Izuku was about to launch into yet another verbal tirade against the man, he suddenly picked up the pace. Just to stop himself from falling to the ground, he was forced to keep up, stumbling along with the man. This wasn't good. Life force was always on, and he couldn't turn it off. Running for 5 minutes out of Tartarus made him feel like he'd been running for 5 hours. And now at this pace, something just above what would be termed a brisk walk, he felt like he was trying to sprint. Whereas before Izuku was certain if he just had a spot to sit down and relax for a bit he could have gotten his breathing under control, now he easily recognized that the very thing he'd sought to avoid was going to happen. He couldn't keep up. His lungs were simply not good enough to handle this right now, and he was already pushing past their limits. Belatedly, Izuku realized his rising panic was probably not helping matters as his breathing became ever more erratic, each breath now coming out as little more than a strangled wheeze. Hearing this, his companion responded by trying to move even faster. Haruki, really, I'm fine. There it was again. The silence, the judgment, Yeah, I don't get paid enough for this and you're the one who's paying me. Look, really, I'm fine. It just shocked me, she lifelessly replied, knowing full well how she truly felt on the inside. It wasn't fine. How could it be fine? Nothing about this was okay. But it didn't matter. She was quirkless now, worthless. She was a burden to her former team. And now she was making a burden of herself at the psychiatry office she was gently escorted to after she'd apparently entered a minor catatonic state in her hotel room. Tomoko, I find it hard to believe that you're doing fine, considering the state your family found you. They're not my family, Tomoko interrupted, perhaps sounding a bit harsher than she intended. Why did everyone always assume they were a family? People always said that. But then when they wanted the team to swing by or make an appearance, they'd be confused when Tomoko showed up with them. Like she was a not particularly well-liked stepdaughter unwillingly dragged to a family dinner to meet people she wasn't related to. True to her professional nature, the therapist managed not to alter her impassive face at all upon Tomoko's interjection, but she stopped fiddling with the pen in her hand. Tomoko knew all her tells by now. She had a great poker face, but the rest of her was quite expressive. Her foot bounced up and down upon the floor when she felt tired. She'd hiccup and literal bubbles would pop out of her mouth when she got scared. She was constantly spinning around a pen in her offhand, so if it stopped twirling, that meant she was startled or disappointed. Usually disappointed. That's all anyone seemed to be with Tomoko nowadays. She didn't want to be here. Someone else who needed this type of help should be in her place. All she did was waste space now. Tomoko, Tartarus prison right off the coast of the Chiba prefecture, surely having that man break out so close to your current location was alarming. Something like that is a perfectly reasonable cause for emotional distress, the therapist explained, using that same condescending tone of voice. Tomoko hated those angular, old lady glasses she had on her face. They seemed to only serve the purpose of sliding down off her nose whenever she spoke, forcing the woman to constantly push them back up. It gave her that holier-than-thou aura that made her very skin crawl whenever she tried to level with the former pro. I'm fine. There's no reason he'd come and attack me. I've got nothing he wants anymore. So why would I be worried? She drawled, undaunted by the woman's reasoning. There it was. Tomoko admitted to gaining a small amount of satisfaction whenever she succeeded in doing it, making the therapist frown. It was quite rare. She was good with that poker face, but sometimes Tomoko could upset the stoic woman. It was the little victories that counted. She knew the truth of what happened to Tomoko, but she didn't understand. Couldn't feel that soul-wrenching, mind-numbing pain of having a quirk ripped out of your unwilling body. Quirks are like muscles, and having it forcibly removed was like someone reached inside her body and ripped out a few organs. Her fingers were numb for weeks after the incident. The incident. What a funny thing to call the worst event that could possibly happen to someone. Trying to minimize what it actually was, a low buzzing noise echoed round the room, the source emanating from the woman's pocket. Finally, time was up for the emergency session. Why did she have to come for this garbage? She was paying extra to do something she didn't even want to do. Oh right, Shino and Yawara all but forced her, while Ryuko had gone back to their shared apartment to feed her cats while she recovered. Tomoko hated that too. A shared apartment. It was hers, damn it. Ryuko basically lived there now to watch out for her sis. All that meant was she interrupted Tomoko's quiet time, forced her to watch random garbage she never actually wanted to see in the first place, ate all her candy, and even sometimes brought guys back to her apartment after a date. It was her apartment, not RYUKO's. Why couldn't she take her latest fling to her own damn apartment? It wasn't even that far away from hers, maybe a block or two. Your apartment's so nice though, Tomo. Come on, you know it's far too big for one person. I'm just filling it up. Ryuko never could seem to understand that perhaps she was okay with her admittedly large apartment being empty. She wasn't trying to fill her life with someone else right now. She tried that a few months back. It didn't work. Sure, it was kind of fun to just let loose and give in to her impulses. But after the third girl and fifth guy passed through her bedroom, she just started feeling lonely. No one stuck around in the morning or asked for a second date. Not that the bars she frequented really counted as a first date, but still. Admittedly, this was Tomoko's own fault. She never asked for anything further, and considering they were all one-night stands, she didn't expect her partners to do so either. Perhaps that was why it hurt so much though. She couldn't even impress them enough that they'd want to ask for more. She was sexy, damn it. Ryuko didn't get to have the monopoly on dating. How come she got chased after all the time while Tomoko didn't? She shuddered. It was probably because Ryuko was a shameless flirt 24/7, while Tomoko only engaged in the act when she felt like it. Plus, she didn't blatantly ogle anyone who so much as glanced in her general direction. She introduced herself, gave off a sweet smile, made sure they were single, and then shamelessly ogled them. Professionals have standards. Ugh, maybe she should get a roommate. An actual one. That'd give her an excuse to kick out Ryuko, at least. She couldn't bring herself to just tell her former teammate off like she wanted to, so a roommate would give her a plausible excuse to kick the woman to the curb. She was getting fed up with her antics at this point, even if they were fun at first. Tomoko was snapped out of her introspection with a sigh from the therapist, whose brow was furrowed at some message she was reading on her phone. Odd, she rarely showed any emotion. That poker face was great. What could the message say that shook the impressive foundations of emotional callousness the woman had erected? Strangely, the therapist turned the device around and held the screen up to Tomoko's vision, a government alert plastered on the screen. It contained a lot of legal jargon and other such nonsense designed to dance around the issue at hand in as many words as physically possible. But basically, it boiled down to a pre-evacuation warning. Tartarus wasn't holding up well, and while she wasn't currently apprised of the situation, just looking at the news footage from a few hours prior was proof enough that they weren't holding the ground. Considering the complex was built outside this prefecture, well, assuming they couldn't defend the bridge connecting the artificial island to the mainland, this city would be one of the first stops all those villains came across. Basically, pack your bags and maybe consider the idea of leaving on the off chance they had to order it anyways. The therapist tried to scroll up with her thumb to hide the little snippet of text at the bottom of the screen. But Tomoko had, by sheer chance, started reading from the bottom when she first saw the page. There was a manhunt out for All for One. Her jaw tightened at the mere mention of his name, but she was in far more control of her emotions than she was last night. Honestly, her little attack was mostly caused by the sheer shock she felt that a man with such terrible injuries could escape that complex. Now that she was slightly more level-headed, however, objective thinking had returned to her. From what she recalled of the man, he was injured even further than he was previously after his last fight with All Might, and his life support needs had increased ever more. Since he broke out, he either took his life support with him, which seemed unlikely since it was probably bolted into Tartarus floors, or he managed to crawl away before his wounds got the best of him. If that warper Kirigiri had escaped too, she would have had cause for concern, which, while it was still a very real possibility, she assumed that if the complex was able to report the escape of All for One, they would have mentioned that Kirigiri facilitated it if the warper was involved. As such, it seemed likely he probably made a smash and dash out of the building, with the intent on figuring out things as he went. The thought brought a small smile to her face. There was no way he'd be able to survive without advanced life support with those injuries of his for long, so even if he did escape, he very well could just be dead on the ground right now, somewhere no one would ever find the body. Jesus Christ, Haruki, where'd you find him? Boy, less chatter, we need to get fluids into him right away. Oxygen. We need that too, guy can't seem to breathe. Hey, you with us? A pair of fingers snapped in front of Izuku's vision, and, with quite literally monumental effort, the former greenette swatted the offending hand away from his vision. He wanted to reply. He wanted to tell these people to go away and leave him in peace for a few hours, but the walk-turn-run to this clinic or whatever had drained Izuku's remaining dregs of stamina. His breathing had reverted back to its levels at Tartarus, each inhalation equitable to inhaling molten magma, and despite the fact that the action caused incredible pain, his body refused to cease performing the operation even when it provided very little tangible benefit. Labored wheezing had at some point transformed into strangled gasps, but at this point Izuku couldn't muster enough brain power to activate a quirk. He was completely ready and willing to rip his lungs out and take the chance that super regeneration might heal them, because the alternative was death and he was already knocking on that particular door yet again. But he couldn't concentrate enough to activate that stupid quirk, and instead he just kept inefficiently smashing his palms against his chest. We need to call an ambulance, get this guy to an actual hospital. We're not equipped for this, he needs surgery. Akatani, call TH. No can do. He can't go there, just trust me on that. What do you, is that a Tartarus jumpsuit? Haruki, what the hell did yo? Guys, pulse is getting weaker here. We need to stabilize him before it's too late. We can't treat him, he's from. You'll be greatly rewarded for helping him out, take me word for it. Especially Yaos, Akatani. He can get you what you want. Christ, he's bribed the homeless guy. Someone get Haruki out of H here. Izuku wasn't entirely sure what was going on as the black spots swimming around his vision continuously obscured his sight line. But the room he was in seemed to suddenly get several degrees warmer. No, that's not possible. You're quirkless, formerly, and Yaos can be too, Tanaka, if and you help him out. We can't. What about your kid, Akatani? 6 years old and no quirk, right? That's not the life you'll want for her, is it? Less bickering, more oxygen, people. Get me that damn mask, now. As Izuku finally faded from consciousness, the last thing he felt was something plastic being slid over his mouth, and, just for a moment, it almost felt like he could breathe again. The last time Izuku ended up here, he was filled with trepidation, but managed to remain calm. After all, he was surrounded by people he genuinely came to consider to be the greatest heroes of all time. Now though, he was filled with no small amount of terror. First, he didn't have one for all anymore. This blackened mindscape or whatever it was should not be a place Izuku was able to visit. and considering he'd fallen asleep, lost consciousness in Tartarus and never ended up here, the timing was rather suspect. Second, whenever he ended up here, he always found himself surrounded by this veil of darkness that prevented him from talking or even moving, which was now suspiciously absent, for the most part. Oh, that veil of immovable darkness was still here, but it wasn't wrapped around him for once. No, it was coalescing around the one person he honestly wished he'd never have to see nor hear from ever again. Kai Chisaki, MMNGGFH, MMRRNGGH. It seemed the feeling was mutual. Izuku was slightly thankful that the shadow cloak ensnared the former mob boss, because it meant the man couldn't hurl insults or death threats at Izuku anymore. Plus, it meant he wouldn't have to respond to him. He didn't exactly trust his own voice right now. Just by glancing down at his hands, he could tell exactly why Chisaki seemed so furious. His hands were old. Specifically, they were the hands from his old body. Slightly crooked fingers, a bent, uneven right hand, and a series of scars trailing up and down his arm. Thankfully, the chronic pain sometimes brought by his mangled ligaments wasn't present. Based on his arm, though, it was safe to assume that the rest of Izuku's body was back to its original state, which really added more credence to the idea that this body was constructed from his own mental self-image. If so, he could, theoretically, manipulate this form to look however he wanted. Sadly, he was a little more freaked out by the implications of everything around him to put that theory to the test. Chisaki was here, in this weird one-for-all-like mindscape, and beyond Izuku, there was absolutely no one here. Just as in One for All, nothing but a densely fogged, black void surrounded the pair, and beyond Overhaul's muffled screaming and writhing, the place was deathly silent. In the back of his mind, Izuku was pleased. That theory he had about all his current quirks being carbon copies of the originals seemed all the more plausible given this situation, but at the same time, another part of him was mortified. This was all but definitive proof that quirks contained, at least, an imprint of the original user's personality and at most, their very soul. For his own selfish goals, Izuku stole a fragment of Chisaki's soul, and now that part of the man was trapped forever here with Izuku. He wanted to hurt Chisaki, yes, but not like this. Isolation was horrendous. He barely got out of Tartarus with his sanity intact, and part of that was because he could occasionally interact with other humans, even if they did torture and despise him. Here, there was literally nothing. MMFNGH. A long time and no see. Izuku stuttered out, wincing at how himself he was acting. Hell, he was even hunching in on himself and nervously wringing his hands again. Where the hell was his all-for-one-ness when he needed it? All right, why you just do? Stay there, and I'll see you never, he stammered, quickly turning on his heel and dashing off into the misty darkness, hoping beyond hope Chisaki wouldn't warp around and follow him. As he ran, the fact that Izuku couldn't shake the feeling of someone staring at him from far, far away in the mist didn't exactly help ease that fear. He needed time to process all this, assuming he didn't die on the spot of wherever Haruki managed to drag him to. There was a new roadblock he'd have to overcome. Instinctively, Izuku knew one couldn't just store a quirk in a freezer to use at a later date. If a quirk was taken out of someone through artificial means, it'd have to be stored inside a living person, Midoriya surmised, snapping his fingers. Then, another thought entered his mind. The sprinting greenette skidded to a stop, red shoes kicking up misty darkness as he slowed. I don't have Search. I have a copy of it, but I do have Overhaul's quirk, and a piece of his soul. It suddenly hit him like a truck. A piece of Ragdoll's soul is trapped. And not to mention hundreds of other people. Midoriya couldn't help his heart rate from accelerating a bit, partially from the realization that somewhere, Ragdoll, or at least a part of her, was dealing with the same thing Chisaki was right now. Stuck in a dark void for eternity, totally restrained and immobile. The other thing that made his heart race was the still present sensation of being watched. The absolute worst thing about it was that he didn't even feel it all around him. He had the distinct impression that somewhere far off in the distance, specifically to the northeast, there was something standing totally still, unblinking, and entirely focused on him. It wasn't a good feeling. Midoriya again dashed off into the darkness, hoping he could escape the invisible gaze of whatever lurked in the distance. Even as he did so, he planned. He couldn't just leave things like that. He couldn't just abandon all those trapped souls to remain stuck in whatever biological monstrosity of a storage container Dr. Garaki created to house All for One's quirk. Or worse, inside Tamura. I'll huff save you Ragdoll. Huff I'll save you all. He wasn't a hero. He couldn't be a hero. But Midoriya couldn't ignore someone in need, either. Arata Haruki was the kind of man who rolled with the punches. Specifically, when he got punched, he'd roll over and take it because what exactly was he supposed to do about it? He wasn't too keen on getting sent to prison, like many of the younger quirkless generations seemed to be doing. When he was growing up, being quirkless was simply uncommon, not a rarity. Nowadays, being born quirkless was all but considered a disease. He lost his job at the company he'd invested 30 years of his life into after some new, hotshot CEO took over and started systematically purging anyone who didn't have a quirk from his offices. Technically, that claim was never proven in a court of law, and Haruki was forbidden from voicing his opinions on the man or the matter thanks to the agreement he was forced to sign when his lawsuit was settled out of court. But in the privacy of his own mind, he was certainly allowed to think it. His fear of prison had lessened over the years, though, and he was starting to see why many of the younger quirkless population had largely turned into criminals or killed themselves. People didn't want to hire quirkless people, and often this led to such individuals being unable to pay for basic necessities. As such, they turned to thievery to survive. Surprise, surprise. When cops have the ability to track you down by your scent alone, and you couldn't fight back effectively, you'd end up getting caught. You'd get fines mostly, because hey, you don't have a quirk. That means nobody particularly saw you as a threat to society, so who cares, which they'd be unable to pay off. Said people would commit more crimes to try and pay off the debts, get caught again, rack up more debt, and then, eventually, they'd be thrown in jail for failing to pay the city all the fines they'd accrued. Such individuals would spend the next 5 years or so in federal prisons being used as low-tier laborers to perform meager tasks so they could work off their debts. They'd get released back into society, and the cycle would repeat. Such was life. Homeless for the past 8 years, Haruki had to admit, thievery had become necessary for him to survive. Apples at the farmers' markets, sometimes simple sandwiches at the convenience store when the dumpsters he dove through didn't have enough food for him to subsist on, etc. Recently, he'd honestly considered mugging someone, and not for the reasons one might expect. No, he wanted to be caught for the mugging, as that was serious enough to potentially get him thrown in prison. Prison had heating. Prison had free healthcare. Prison was a roof over your head and 3 square meals a day. For a 73-year-old quirkless man with no family, no job, and no life prospects, and a mildly concerning pain in his stomach that had increasingly grown worse and worse over the past several months, prison almost sounded like a dream come true. Staring down at his hands, Haruki tugged on that new sensation inside his body and watched in awe as his hands, plain as can be, covered in torn calluses and wrinkles, started to glow whitish red, the air directly above them shimmering as the temperature distorted it. Just as quickly as the color bloomed, so too did the heat flare to life. It was like opening an oven and feeling the heat rush out and blast you in the face, but coming from his own damn hands. He had a quirk. Hot hands, he was told to call it. It was his. He owned nothing but the clothes on his back in that tent. Now, he had the one thing he'd wished for ever since he was a kid, and no one would take it from him. Really, there was only one person who could take it from him, and as such, he was going to do everything in his power to stay on said man's good side. He wanted him to buy some bullshit story about being a 19-year-old kid from UA. Fine, whatever. He got it. Plausible deniability and all that. Really, he didn't care. All for one wanted to find Ragdoll so he can give back the quirk he stole a while ago. Sure, why not? He could have said he wanted Haruki to melt the doors off ATMs so he could snag the cash inside, and he would have gone along with it. Short of killing someone, he probably would have agreed to anything. Just fulfilling expectations would never be enough. However, Arata had climbed the corporate ladder before, and was doing it rather successfully before said ladder was kicked over. If you wanted to get ahead, you didn't just do as you were asked. You went beyond, plus ultra, and stayed ahead of the game. Thus, he'd spent nearly 2 full days doing his level best to calm the staff of the free clinic he occasionally went to for assistance, using every ounce of his skills as a former salesman to make all for one as palatable as possible. For some, it wasn't too difficult. One of the nurses here happened to be quirkless, and readily assisted Haruki in advocating for the escaped villain not 5 minutes after he promised him a quirk. Hopefully, all for one would be willing to provide on said promise. Another staffer had a quirkless daughter. They too fell in line rather fast, and several other staffers owned rather useless quirks that weren't particularly great in the grand scheme of things, like the lead doctor who had a slightly enhanced sense of smell, the receptionist with graphite fingernails, and another nurse with the unfortunate ability to shatter the bones in her hands on command and reform them into claw-like structures which pierced through her skin. Sadly, said quirk didn't come with any ability to numb pain, nor could she revert the claws back to their previous functional structure. She'd apparently used the ability a grand total of 4 times in her life, 3 when she was still a child and hoped to get a handle on it, and once to defend herself from a mugger. It took a bit of prodding, but after being promised a quirk that'd make her own power actually viable, she'd reluctantly acquiesced to Arata's demands. 1. Don't send all for one to a hospital. They were to treat him here, with whatever they had on hand. 2. Don't call the damn cops, and shut up about his presence. 3. Arata stayed by his side at all times. Haruki didn't particularly want to be by the man's side 24/7, but they weren't sure when he'd wake up. Thanks to a nurse incorrectly inserting an IV needle and having to reposition it, they'd learned firsthand about his rapid regeneration quirk. Surgery wasn't going to be an option for them since they couldn't combat that power. Thus, they'd been forced to simply provide the man with various nutrients and fluids, as well as supplementary oxygen. It had taken a bit of trial and error to figure it out, but the man's lungs simply weren't up to snuff. They tentatively functioned without assistance, but their ability to take in air seemed severely compromised. The extra oxygen definitely eased his burden, which would have to be enough. His throat was messed up something fierce, but was healing on its own. He'd simply need to allow it to rest. And, considering his unconscious state, was performing that task quite admirably. Without his near-constant coughing fits, the tissue in his esophagus would apparently sort itself out. Whatever his mobility issue was, the doctor couldn't discover. His muscles were apparently stiffer than a corpse's, and there was no apparent reason why. It was obviously a quirk, but quirks were generally helpful. This seemed more like a massive hindrance than anything else. So everyone was quite stumped. Perhaps when Izuku woke up, he could provide the answers they needed to properly assist him. Still though, that was why Haruki insisted on staying by the man's side. While he didn't hold it against All for One considering the state he was in and how awful his injuries seemed to be. He really needed a better cover story than that thing the villain attempted to feed him. As such, the former salesman took it upon himself to craft a far superior story, and told the hospital staff his own version of events to make the man seem less threatening. Now though, he had to stick around to appraise Izuku of the new story he'd crafted, lest the man's ignorance come back to bite him. His knowledge on the villain was limited to his first-hand experience with the man in his clearly delusional state right after escaping Tartarus, and the very restricted snippets of information the media and police released on him following his defeat at the Camino ward. It was entirely possible All for One would wake up, discover he was no longer in critical condition, and murder all the witnesses around to cover his tracks. Haruki appreciated the people at the free clinic, as they'd assisted him numerous times and were generally polite and courteous to him. The man figured if he was able to convince All for One that the staff wouldn't be a threat or a liability to him, he'd deem it unnecessary to kill them. Despite not knowing his character well, Arata held no illusions about the man he'd thrown his lot in with. Anyone brutal enough to be considered All Might's archenemy was not someone to be trifled with. Haruki. He was still trying to get used to that as well. The eggshells everyone in the clinic seemed to be walking on around him. As far as they were concerned, Arata had been appointed All for One's official unofficial right-hand man, which meant people seemed to dance around him with a healthy air of cautious worry. It didn't help that Haruki never corrected these assumptions. But the free food they'd been providing him with, as well as a cot for him to rest upon, were benefits he wasn't willing to pass up. The homeless man nodded and cast his weary gaze towards the newcomer, Tanaka, the quirkless nurse. Why you, might want to come see this. One of his old allies is, well, they're in the news. Shit. Arata managed to keep his face calm and nodded appreciatively, slowly removing his heavy-set frame from the plastic chair he'd parked himself in next to the stretcher Izuku had been lying unconscious upon since his arrival. Even while he followed Tanaka to the staff break room, which had recently become more like a debate hall. War room considering how often the clinic's members seemed to congregate inside it for shouting matches on the morality of what they were doing. His mind was racing for excuses. If Tanaka was able to say with certainty that All for One's allies were in the news, they likely presented themselves as such. If they were doing that, it meant they were trying to contact him. Whatever they were offering the man was likely far superior to the ragtag group Haruki cobbled together through blatant lies. His current web of support was about as structurally sound as a house of cards. As soon as the man learned his old group mates were trying to find him, everyone's lives here, including his own, would be tossed in limbo. As the flimsy plastic break room door was pushed aside, the ancient tube television that sat upon the snack counter was in the middle of showing a video broadcast from Japan's Hero News Network. While he couldn't remember the man's name since it had been so long since he last heard it, he definitely recognized the villain in the video. Gray, greasy hair, lanky body, tall yet perpetually hunched over and covered in disembodied, mummified hands. At Kurogiri. He'll know where to go. I can't say more. The damn doctor turned on us, sensei. He turned. But we can still fix this. Kurogiri knows my private hideouts. Get him, and you can get to me. We can win. I know you're still out there. That you're still alive. Nothing can keep you down. The video feed cut as one of the nurses, Akiko, a fiery redhead, clicked it off with the remote, haphazardly tossing the device onto the counter afterwards and crossing her arms. With a peeved expression upon her face, she turned around and faced Haruki with no small amount of contempt. Can't you all see? This is what happens when we ally ourselves with a villain. She practically screeched. How many people have to die before we do the right thing? If he was back in prison, that madman wouldn't be searching for him like this, Haruki had to admit. One of the perks of his ungroomed facial hair was its ability to conceal his features. The frown upon his face would undoubtedly be very pronounced. Otherwise, this wasn't part of the plan. Come on now. This isn't his fault. We can't hold him responsible for his old faults. He's a new man. He raised his hands in a placating manner. It looked like the quirkless nurse, Tanaka, was about to voice her support for Haruki's claim, but was cut off by Akiko's much louder exclamation of, "Bullshit. I don't care if he got his personality swapped. That doesn't excuse the whatever he's done. He's All Might's archenemy. He belongs in prison." The head doctor, Odashi, wasn't what many people would think of when the word doctor came to mind. While he was garbed in the traditional white coat many doctors wore, his large, rotund body and wavy, neck-length hair that seemed particularly unkempt didn't exactly scream professional. The impressive neckbeard he was starting to sport didn't help his image either. But that was more the fault of the situation everyone found themselves in rather than a conscious choice on his part. Since nobody had actually left the clinic since All for One's arrival, everyone had been forced to rely on the amenities already stocked within to support themselves. Shaving razors was one of the many things they did not have here, and everyone was getting tired of vending machine sandwiches at this point. "Haruki," the doctor mumbled, idly scratching his spiky chin and attracting the attention of everyone in the break room. "Even if he is a totally different man, he's still dangerous, not just to everyone else, but to himself. Power, it corrupts." Again, Haruki didn't exactly have an argument against their points. What he did have, however, was petty bribery. "Doc, be thinking about this. You have a chance to be something great. Oh, many times Ave Yaus tried to apply somewhere else. Ta some big name hospital with a nice paycheck. Only Tabi rejected since it don't got no healing quirk. I know it's more than once." Much to Akiko's anger, the doctor looked away from Murata's gaze, unable to refute the claim. "All for One can help Yaus out. Can help all of us out. Yeah, come on Akiko, don't throw this chance away. I don't want to be quirkless if I don't have to. I mean, you even had your daughter brought here. What's with the change of heart all of a sudden?" Tanaka chimed in with his unique brand of support, flinching back when Akiko turned her seething glare upon him. "I had my daughter brought here because I can't just say, 'Hey sis, mind watching my kid for a while so I can live in the clinic for a bit?' Yeah, my coworkers are threatening me with their new, cult-like behavior and I'm not entirely sure I'd be allowed to leave the building with my life." She spat, glaring at anyone who dared to meet her gaze. Shima, the blonde receptionist with a round face and utterly plain features, meekly piped up from her spot in the corner of the break room. "Akiko, we wouldn't have." "Save it." The redhead cut her off with a wave of her hand. "I saw what you were doing with your fingers. You were getting ready to use your quirk on me when I tried to walk out that door, weren't you?" she accused, causing the blonde to look away in shame. I wasn't. Not intentionally, Akiko. I just felt as scared, you know." "No, I don't know. I get that being quirkless isn't great, and all that, but that doesn't mean we can just discard our morals at the drop of a hat. I'd do almost anything to give my daughter a quirk, but not like this. For God's sake, people, he doesn't make quirks, he steals them. Whatever quirk you get out of this deal with the devil belonged to someone else before he stole it." Akiko screeched, tugging her crimson locks in frustration. Haruki found himself clenching his fists in frustration. Again, he didn't really have a counter-argument. She was right on all accounts, and while years of thievery to survive had loosened his own morals enough that he couldn't care less about the fact that hot hands was once someone else's quirk, that didn't mean everyone else was as morally flexible. Nor should they be, to be honest. Arata was still healthy enough to recognize his mindset wasn't a good one. Before the homeless man could throw out another cookie-cutter whataboutism into the argument, he realized something. Akiko," Arata questioned, drawing the woman's baleful glare to himself. "Oh no, we ain't exactly in agreement, but even I can admit it'd probably be a good idea to keep your daughter nearby. Yeah. Where'd your tyke run off to?" Hateful eyes instantly shrank to pinpricks, her neck snapping over to Shima so fast he heard something crack. Slowly, every pair of eyes followed her gaze, and soon the poor receptionist was sweating buckets under the newfound scrutiny. As she said she was going to the bathroom. "How long ago?" Odashi hesitantly asked, already slowly rising from his chair. She murmured, quickly glancing at the wall clock hanging in the corner of the room. Oh dear. Haruki turned on his heel and started making his way out of the room, intent on getting to All for One's side before a curious little girl woke the man up early and got on his bad side. As soon as he opened the staff room's door though. "Oh, hi, Mr. Haruki," Akiko's daughter, a pinkette with noticeably non-Japanese features, which, considering her American heritage that wasn't really a surprise, still managed to speak the language perfectly. Despite being confined to the clinic for the past 2 days with her mother, she was still garbed in her school's uniform. Apparently she just liked it. Haruki stepped to the side and allowed the girl to reach her mother, who noticeably calmed down upon seeing her daughter's face. The redhead scooped up the pinkette and hugged her tightly, though she did manage to continue glaring at Shima over her daughter's shoulder. The little girl craned her neck around, staring at Haruki from her perch in her mother's arms. "Your friend's weird, Mr. Haruki." Instantly, everybody in the room tensed, no one more so than Akiko, making her tighten the already vice-like grip she had upon the girl. "Hey, Mom, you're hurting me," she squirmed, trying and failing to escape Akiko's grasp. "Honey," Akiko began, voice dangerously low, "which friend of Haruki's are you referring to?" The Pinketty didn't bother trying to speak, only meekly pointing at the door behind Haruki while still furiously struggling to escape. While he didn't exactly think he was in danger, the sight of every single person he was in the room with looking at the door, gasping, then scooting, stepping as far back as physically possible from something he himself couldn't see. Well, it was particularly unnerving. Slowly, the scraggly man turned around and came face to face with the sight he entirely expected to see, but hoped he wouldn't. All for one, standing in the hallway, holding the door open with one hand and tugging the ventilator they'd hooked the man up to behind him with the other. He was still wearing the outfit they'd slid him into, a pair of gray sweatpants and matching slippers, though he still wore no shirt. His emerald green eyes scanned the room curiously, and though his expression was hard to determine thanks to the plastic mask covering the lower half of his mouth, his brow was furrowed in confusion. Hi," All for One announced, holding up a hand in greeting. "I've heard some people around here need a new quirk." Yes, eyes. "See, I told you the news would broadcast it, I told you. Those vultures can't resist the chance to up their damn ratings." Silence greeted his declaration. Still, that was nothing new, so Shigaraki continued unabated. "He'll be back, he'll get Kurogiri, and he'll fix me. I'll be whole again. I'll be normal. Things can go back to the way they used to be." More silence. This time, it annoyed Shigaraki. What was the point of all this if they didn't respond? Things were going well, for once. If anyone could solve their problems, it was Sensei. He'd get things back on track. The now fractured group could overcome their differences, and they could go about dismantling Hero Society once more. With a frustrated growl, the man turned to look at his comrades he so graciously provided protection for, and glared at them from behind his father's hand. Things had been going well, once. Sure, they may have hit a rough patch a year and a half back, but now that the solution presented itself, why stay mad? "I don't get you, you ungrateful bastards. Why, can't you see our losing streak is over now?" He received 5 glares in return. "Don't give me those looks," he complained, reaching up to scratch that ever-present itch upon his neck, only for his fingers to bounce off the plastic brace he wore nowadays. Annoyed yet again that he couldn't provide himself with any relief, he continued to rant. "We've been over this. It's too dangerous for us topside. We've got to stay down here where it's safe. But, now that Sensei's out, he can fix me, and we can run free again." Yet more silence. Growling, Shigaraki reached into his pocket and pulled out the remote, slapping his thumb across the big red button at the bottom. Simultaneously, 5 cries of pain rang out across the video feeds he had set up, one for each of his league's members. All of their bodies convulsed as electricity arced through their bodies, and continued to do so for the 5 long seconds Tamura kept his thumb pressed down on the button. By the time he finished, all his comrades looked worn out, ragged, and utterly defeated. A 6th screen suddenly flashed with life, and a particularly haggard-looking Twice Sans mask popped up on screen. "What?" The man practically spat, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Shigaraki matched his expression, holding up the remote to his camera and hovering his thumb threateningly over a small, yellow-colored button with the words Himiko Toga messily scrawled beside it. Just from that action alone, Twice's eyes widened and he immediately schooled his expression into something more appropriate. Despite his irreplaceable importance, Twice was quite the pain in Tamura's side nowadays. It was almost like a reverse Kurogiri in some instances, invaluable in the long run, but unlike Kurogiri, horrendously disrespectful and borderline insubordinate. He missed the misty bartender. Blackmail wasn't necessary to keep him in line. He was created for the express purpose of listening to Shigaraki, so really, he didn't need to do anything in that regard. For Twice, well, he had Toga. Nothing, just a misclick. The hand-covered villain replied, waving off his underling's incredulous look. "A misclick," he ground out, his voice on the edge of transforming into a shout. Shigaraki nodded. "Still, since you're here, any word from Jurin?" The man's eyes shifted to the right, momentarily sparing the ragged-looking information broker on one of Shigaraki's screens a passing glance, but immediately redirected his attention back to Tamura. "No," he replied after a moment. "No word from Compressor Spinner either, but both are still prowling around." The man paused for a moment, obviously pained, but eventually straightened himself back up and managed to speak. "There's and no word from Toga either. Shia hasn't had luck getting past the Tartarus villain's bridge blockade." The second he finished speaking, Tamura slammed his thumb down on the yellow button, and Miko's haggard, feminine screams sounded through the video call, and Twice clearly struggled not to cry out alongside her. While it was difficult, Tamura could faintly hear the man's phone vibrating in the background of his video feed, the one he'd hooked up to Toga's collar. It was quite amusing to buzz the man by literally buzzing Toga herself. He originally had Twice's phone number, but after a while the man decided to be petty and kept letting Shigaraki go to voicemail. The second he hooked his phone up to Toga's collar though, his response time markedly increased. Wake her again, and tell her to get it right. Sensei's alive, but he might be in trouble. Without Kurogiri, he won't be able to move around much. We need people inside the prison. Tell Compress and Spinner to search harder too. I don't give a shit what they have to do, just find Sensei. Before the man could reply, Shigaraki cut off his camera feed and turned his attention back to the other league members. Toga's cat-like eyes stared at him through the video screen with unadulterated hatred. Her hair frazzled, unkempt, and wild. It had nearly grown down to her waist since it had been so long since she last had it cut. His other comrades were in similar states, sans Spinner, whose purple hair was actually the result of a cosmetic surgery he underwent, and was more akin to an implanted wig than actual hair. All of them glared at Tamura like he was some kind of freak, even though he was saving their damn skins. They'd understand eventually. It was just safer this way. Why bother going outside to do things when they had Twice on their side? It was far safer to just send a clone out to perform the tasks, since those were disposable and easily recreatable. Except, of course, himself. While he had no doubt Jin would recreate him since he held the codes to his friend's cells, he didn't want to risk it. It wasn't fun being recreated, knowing that the original version of you was dead. Soon though, Sensei would be back. The Metal Liberation Army may have gotten in a lucky hit and killed him, but he survived that. Once Sensei returned, he'd be able to help. He'd have a quirk of some kind to fix this, know a doctor who could help him, or had some method of getting Shigaraki back to normal. Until then, he was safe down here. So were his allies. Everything he did now was for his own safety, as well as their own. For him, he had this room built. No sharp edges, padded and soft surfaces all around. And absolutely everything was designed to be as safe as possible. Even if it was torture, he kept that plastic collar around his neck to stop his fingers from scratching at his flesh, since that could, and had, resulted in his demise before. When you had the durability of a Twice clone, you had to be careful. His allies were still their original selves, but they'd somehow gotten it into their head 2 years back that Tamura wasn't a good enough leader anymore, since he started acting more cautious once he was revived by Twice. Said they wanted to seek employment elsewhere. He couldn't allow that. He needed them. If they went off on their own, they might get themselves fucking killed and he'd have even less allies to call upon in his time of need. So, for his own benefit and their safety, he had them locked up in their own little rooms, kept close to him. He tried to explain it to them. At first, they could still go above ground and live their lives, just, though Twice clones, like him. They didn't get it though, they just didn't get it. Hell, Dabai's clone and Jurin's clone actually teamed up to try and kill him. Tamura was forced to take matters into their own hands. If there was one thing he'd learned in life, it was that pain was the world's most powerful motivator. He slapped shock collars around their necks, bolted them to the walls in their rooms, and made their clones a deal. The real them got to live and didn't suffer, so long as they obeyed. So far, it had been working out pretty damn well. And even Twice, the sole member he hadn't chained up, was beginning to submit to his will. He wanted to keep Twice down here, he really did. But the man needed to move around to use his quirk. He had to be able to get new measurements on his allies and their cells, and occasionally had to travel with the clones to go on missions. Since they had low durability, it sometimes required he accompany them in order to recreate them when they inevitably died in a fight. Soon though, this would all be behind them. Sensei would return. Tamura would be human again. His allies could be free, and All Might would finally die. Things were looking up. Hello there. Of all the ways Midoriya expected to wake up, getting poked in the thigh by a tiny, pink-haired American child with a bob cut wasn't one of them. The perfect Japanese she spoke almost made him do a double take, considering her distinctly non-native appearance. He genuinely couldn't decide if she actually spoke the language, or if his auto-translation quirk was just that good. Hello, he replied, only to cringe at the stuttering. The little girl rocked back and forth on her heels, gazing up at him with a curious stare, yet never meeting his eyes. You don't seem too scary. I didn't think anyone could talk so fast, the little girl mumbled, staring up at Izuku's prone form in something resembling awe. Thankfully, her little statement was enough to snap him out of that muttering storm, causing the former greenette to shake his head violently. With the mental flip of a switch, Midoriya grabbed what remained of All for One and slid the villain's calming confidence over himself, instantly feeling the tension bleed away. Fists unclenched, curled posture straightened, and his rapidly increasing heart rate slowed. Izuku pushed himself upright, taking quick note of his surroundings, and his lack of a shirt. At least he still had pants. From what the former hero could gather, he was in an examination room of some kind. It was tiny, no bigger than 2 or 3 office cubicles smashed together, and was colored a particularly dull shade of gray, with blue and white tiling laid on the floor. Immediately in front of him was a counter with a sink built into it, with 2 small cabinets hanging above. One of those bog-standard hazardous materials wastebaskets was hanging from the wall near the white plywood door, and Izuku himself seemed to be laying down upon a too small examination table, his calves and feet hanging off the end. There was a plastic chair there with a stack of books upon it, and he guessed his feet rested there at one point in time. Next to his makeshift bed was a machine Izuku'd seen far too much of during his time at Tartarus. A dam ventilator of some sort was set up, complete with all those flashing lights, dials, blinky bits, and that ever-present clear, plastic tubing coming out of the machine, connected to a mask at the end of his face. Thankfully, he didn't have any tubes jammed into his neck this time around, nor did he feel anything stuffed inside his lower regions. That was always a plus. Taking a calming breath, Izuku adjusted the plastic mask he reluctantly allowed to remain upon his face into a more comfortable position and addressed the still staring girl in the room. My apologies. I'm not exactly a morning person. She giggled. It's nearly noon. I repeat, I am not a morning person. He shrugged, moving a non-scarred hand up to card through his hair. It appeared his comment offended the child in some way, because she immediately crossed her arms and rolled her eyes. You sound like my brother. You sound like you don't particularly enjoy his company, Izuku countered, quizzically cocking an eyebrow at the child. He still had no idea what she was doing here, or indeed, where here even was. Obviously, it was a clinic of some kind, but Arata's absence made him a little suspicious. He didn't just dream up a homeless man, right? Offhandedly, he attempted to activate hot hands, nodding when he couldn't feel the quirk in his collection anymore. Right, definitely didn't imagine him. One didn't just lose a quirk like that. He couldn't just lose a quirk, right? Thankfully, before he could spiral into yet another mental debate regarding the mechanics of All for One's quirk, the child chimed back in. He's a poopy head. Part of Izuku wanted to laugh at the declaration, but he maintained enough decorum to keep it down to a small smile. How old are you, exactly? He managed to ask with a mostly straight face. 5.5. The Binkette quickly replied. Right, he began, before curiosity got the better of him. Quick tangent. Why, exactly are you here? She cocked her head to the sides, seemingly mouthing the word tangent a few times before giving up. What's tangent mean, mister? Now, it was Izuku's turn to roll his eyes. Damn his extensive vocabulary and penchant for dramatics. Just, offhandedly. Maybe that's too big. It means, well, at least in this case it's being used to talk about a change of subject. She still seemed slightly confused, but thankfully got the gist of it. Mom brought me here to meet you. Hello, alarm bells. Glad to hear you ringing again. That almost shocked Izuku enough to make him stutter. As it was, he understood that All for One's modus operandi in unknown situations was to smile and nod, which was exactly what Izuku intended to do. Of course, he nodded. Though, I must ask, where exactly is your mother? Wordlessly, the girl pointed back at the flimsy door. And why isn't she here with you? He eventually asked, completing the sentiment with a get-on-with-it hand gesture. She shrugged and went back to rocking on her heels. Mom said I shouldn't go into this room till you woke up and she spoke to you first. And you didn't listen. He smirked. Duh, she responded, as though her choices were perfectly logical. Honestly, he couldn't help it. The former greenette chuckled and stretched his hand across the small distance separating them, ruffling the Pinkette's bob cut much to her mild annoyance. What sort of business did your mother wish to discuss with me? The little girl glared at Izuku as she fixed her hair, though maintained the presence of mind to answer. Mom said you could give me a quirk, she answered, managing to look hopeful, doubtful, and annoyed all at once. It was honestly sort of impressive. Outwardly, Izuku smiled and nodded. Giving away quirks wasn't exactly something Izuku was opposed to. Unlike All for One, he didn't have kleptomania nor a penchant to hoard things. It was the why of it all that concerned him. Clearly, people here knew who he was. Well, kinda. Possibly. They obviously knew he was physically All for One. The real question was if they knew who he was mentally. It was possible Haruki told them the truth. For now, though, he decided to err on the side of caution. Well, that's certainly true. I can give you a quirk. In a move that was obviously copied from someone else she'd seen, the girl huffed, cocked her hip out to the side, and rested her hand upon it while staring at Izuku like the youngest, single most disappointed librarian in existence. All she was missing was triangular glasses and a mole on her nose. How exactly are you gonna give me a quirk? Izuku shrugged and replied with the truth. Well, it's what my quirk does. Despite his reassurance, the girl remained unconvinced. With a sigh, Izuku spoke once more. Why don't you just tell me what you want to be when you grow up? I'm sure I have a quirk that'll suit your needs. Mom says I'm gonna be a doctor. She immediately replied. Izuku shook his head. He didn't need a quirk to detect that resigned tone of voice. Your mom may say that, but what do you want to do? It was a good thing both Izuku and All for One, in their respective lives, had a large wellspring of patience to draw upon. Because it seemed for a good minute and a half, all the child did was open her mouth to speak, just to close it shortly afterwards, and then repeated the process. After that small eternity, however, she finally glanced around the room and, for the first time, managed to look him in the eyes. Teal irises stared into his emerald orbs, and he could practically see a little twinkle in them as she spoke. I want to be like a baker or a cook. Whenever I'm sad, I always make cookies so I can feel better, and when my friends are sad, I make them cookies and they feel better too. I want to do that all the time when I grow up, she proclaimed, bunching her fists up into little determined balls in front of her chest as she spoke. The former greenette attempted to bring a hand up to his chin in thought, but the plastic mask pumping oxygen into him got in the way. With a sigh, he once again settled for ruffling his messy hair. Cooking was diverse. There were plenty of quirks he had that could help her, but which one would be the best? A simple fire quirk could be helpful for lighting things, but he sincerely doubted she'd be cooking in an oven that didn't run on electricity in this day and age. Telekinesis to help move things around. Plus, Izuku had to make sure whatever quirk he gave away could be multi-purpose. The little girl wasn't at that age where she'd have totally figured out exactly what it was she wanted to do with her life. She needed a quirk that had other potential applications beyond the kitchen to expand her horizons. Decisions. Do you know what would you say the hardest part of cooking is? He questioned. Again, with very little hesitation, the girl responded. Measuring. I always take too long trying to figure out the proper measurements and stuff. I've never been good with conversions either. At that statement, Izuku already knew the perfect quirk. If the baking thing didn't work out, well, accountants made plenty of money. Once more, he stretched his hand out to place it on the girl's head, this time making sure his palm rested upon the girl's forehead. Before she could protest, Izuku interjected. One moment, this is just how my quirk works. Red bioelectricity arced off his arms, and his hands started to glow with an eerie red light. To the little girl's credit, she didn't so much as flinch at the action, possibly because thanks to his pain-killing quirk, she felt absolutely nothing. Mental calculator slipped away from Izuku's collection and readily flowed into the girl. He wasn't sure if it was due to their quirkless nature, but he could feel a sort of hole inside her, just like with Hirata, one the quirk easily fell into. He'd have to see what it felt like to give a quirk to someone who already had one later. The process lasted less than 5 seconds, and Izuku took his hand away at the end to meet the child's curious stare head-on. What's the square root of 43? The child stared at him like he'd grown a second head. 6.55743 MMPHF. The girl's automatic response was cut off by her slapping 2 hands over her mouth in visible surprise, her pupils shrinking to the size of pinpricks. Izuku couldn't help but smirk at her surprise. How many milliliters in a tablespoon? Hands flew off her mouth momentarily to answer, 15, before they were immediately clamped back over her gob. How many teaspoons in a milliliter? 1/5. Cups in a quart. 4 cups is 1 quart. Liters in a gallon. 3.8. What's the formula to convert Celsius to Fahrenheit? You take the temperature in Celsius, multiply it by 1.8, add that number to 32. At this point, Izuku's smirk had transitioned to a full-on smile, and he stared down at the girl with unconcealed amusement. The pinkette herself was simply gripping her head in between her hands, mumbling inaudibly to herself as conversions, formulas, and answers to any remotely mathematical in nature appeared before her mind's eye. You know, Izuku chimed. Mental calculator is technically an intelligence-boosting quirk, so you should find it easier to remember things now, even if they don't involve math. Just know your new mental powers may come with the side effect of an increased appetite. Your brain'll need a little extra fuel from now on. Her mouth opened and closed several times, as she tried and failed to articulate her thoughts yet again. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she managed to ask, this your quirk? A strange feeling of nostalgia of some sort welled up in Izuku's chest, the situation reminding him of his old conversations with All Might. Taking a page out of his former mentor's book, Izuku took his pointer finger and pressed it against the girl's chest, right above her heart. It's your quirk. Never forget that. While the little girl shakily clutched her head and kept mumbling under her breath, Izuku cracked the stiffness out of his neck and pushed himself off the bed. Again, to his consternation, it took a lot of effort. Like lifting a 40-pound weight amount of effort. That wasn't particularly difficult, especially for him, but it still wasn't fun to perpetually feel like sandbags were tied around your limbs. Ugh, I need a wheelchair, he lamented, suppressing a small smile as he reimagined the Camino ward fight. But with all for one slumped over in a wheelchair the entire time. Huh, was that Mr.? The child snapped out of her trance, immediately redirecting her attention to Izuku. In response, he simply shook his head and gestured towards the examination room's door. And nothing. Don't worry about it. Why don't you head on over to your mother and I'll follow in a bit, Kay? I'm sure she'll want to talk with me. The little girl nodded and quickly complied, soon leaving Izuku alone to blanch at the prospect of dealing with a potentially angry parent. Logic tended to go straight out the window when a parent felt their child was threatened. His own mother was the perfect example of that. Inko Midoriya could be downright terrifying when she wanted to be. Before he could move forward to follow her, however, Izuku belatedly realized he was basically stuck to the ventilator, keeping his breathing steady, and didn't really have many options for mobility. The thing wasn't small after all, big, bulky, basically an entire cabinet made of metal. Just as he was about to sit back down on the too small cot, he remembered he was all for one now. Gods, I can be so dense at times, he mumbled, snapping his fingers and causing an arc of red electricity to jump between his digits. And bluish-yellow aura soon surrounded the ventilator's entirety, the machine levitating off the ground with ease thanks to Izuku's anti-gravity quirk. With yet another mental tug, the man activated general telekinesis and soon began towing the machine behind him like luggage at an airport. Now that he wasn't bone-dead tired from running out of Tartarus and constantly using overhaul to meander forward, he was able to keep walking forward at a steady pace, even if it felt like a slightly strenuous exercise. He could keep pace like this for a few hours. Pushing the door open, the former greenette glanced around the basic beige wall before him, occasionally interspersed with another flimsy door that probably led to an identical examination room. To his own mild surprise, the little girl was waiting for him at the far end of the hallway, and waved when Izuku's gaze met her own. She soon continued on her way, obviously satisfied that he hadn't just gone back to sleep. Shrugging, he started off down the hallways and rounded the bend, quickly approaching an open door with the sounds of various voices emanating from within. Honey, which friend of Haruki's are you referring to? Bracing himself for the worst, Izuku stepped into view behind the door and came face to face with a mass of messy hair. Arata Haruki was standing in front of the open door, back turned to him and facing the rest of the room's inhabitants. In turn, all those inhabitants were all staring, wide-eyed, at him. The little girl was currently being held in the arms of a redhead with piercing eyes, glaring at him partially in surprise and partially in anger. Izuku could actually see the exact moment Arata tensed up, finally realizing there was something behind him he couldn't see. Ever so slowly, the man turned around and stared him in the eyes, mouth opening and closing yet making no sound. Hi, Izuku tried, placatingly raising his hand in greeting. I've heard some people around here need a new quirk. Conference calls were the bane of his existence. They weren't particularly difficult, of course. He went to school and had nearly a decade of experience in the art at this point, but it didn't make them any less taxing, mentally speaking. In person, online, over the phone, it was always the same, regardless of the medium. One had to sit up straight, yet at the same time relax their body so they didn't seem tense, and maintain a sense of calm. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that people had the capability to hear your slouch, since body language tended to have an effect on the tone of your voice, and the people he networked with were trained to sniff out any weakness possible. And the sighing, God, it took him years to get that under control, and even now he still had slip-ups. It was hard not to just slap his hand across his face and release a deep, bone-rattling sigh because sometimes the people he worked with were so stupid it physically hurt. Other businessmen assumed his youth meant inexperience, and attempted to blatantly pull the wool over his eyes with raw deals and hidden clauses in the various contracts he had to work out. Plus, there was the occasional intern who spilled coffee on his shirt which, he understands. He was an intern once too, but did it have to be on his Armani suit? One always had to wear a mask. For the sleazy businessman, one had to look wide-eyed and vulnerable. The intern, one had to look kind and understanding. There was only one time he didn't have to wear a mask really, which was why he was currently carting his hands through the full set of hair on his head, attempting to draw comfort from the act. His face was set in a look of mild annoyance, but that was really just underlying the bone-deep dread that was beginning to creep up on him. The expensive sake he was downing wasn't particularly helping the situation either, despite his genuine hope that it would. Rikia, I assure you, things will be all right, the doctor reassured. How are your new quirks treating you? Redistro responded by glaring at the man's webcam. The doctor's continued attempts to dance around the massive mountain of an issue he was currently facing was duly noted and not appreciated. Those new quirks, honestly, they were great. He felt younger than he ever had in years, and while many wouldn't consider a hair-growing quirk anything important, it meant the world to a man like him. He shuddered. The surgery he had to go through to get those had been less than pleasant, since he had to be awake for the procedure, as artificially implanting a quirk was basically brain surgery for the entire body, but it had only lasted about an hour. Nothing truly unbearable. The results were worth it. A copy of Life Force doubling his lifespan, and then hair growth to cover up his stress-induced hair loss. The tabloids had a field day when he grew all his hair back, but that wasn't anything unusual. And, while painful, the surgery was a distinct reminder of his superiority over Shigaraki. The man couldn't be All for One's successor since he was a clone, as his durability couldn't withstand the stress of it all. Right now, though, Yatsubashi wasn't entirely sure his new hair-growing quirk would outperform the stress he was currently feeling. It was taking all his willpower to not just crush the chair he was sitting in with his original meta ability. He had to save it. He might need to use it. Ding! Ricky sighed in relief at the very welcome notification on his phone from his trusty engineers, informing him that his newly repaired claustro armor had been moved nearby, ready to be deployed at the simple touch of a button with his phone's new app. Taking a deep breath, he smoothed the hair back on his head once more and returned his attention to the computer screen with the doctor's infuriatingly calm visage upon it. I promise you, Redistro, he won't harbor any ill will towards you due to your actions. For not the first time that night, Yatsubashi spat calmly asked, but what if he doesn't? How could he not? Shigaraki was All for One's prodigy. Those were the damn doctor's own words. And he killed that man-child with his bare hands. That wasn't even getting into the whole mess with Gigantomachia, that brute of a man he was forced to use his claustro armor on. Sure, he'd sworn loyalty to the Metal Liberation Army after he killed Shigaraki and proved his superiority. But now that his true master was back, where did that leave him? All for One is a practical sort. He cared very little for Shigaraki, only bothered wasting his time with that man-child because he was the grandson of Nana Shimura, the seventh holder of One for All. Just the mention of that quirk made him wince. Garaki nodded sympathetically. I presume your contacts have been unable to persuade All Might into relinquishing his quirk to them. The hand carding through his hair trailed down his face, pulling skin along its trail. No, but not for lack of trying. He still seems dead set on Tagata, for reasons I can't begin to comprehend. Well, at the very least you've been gathering supporters in UA with your efforts, right? Just because that was true didn't make it a decent concession prize. He was spending a lot of money on those actors he'd hired to get close to All Might, and was rather frustrated that after nearly 2 years of back and forth, will he won't he nonsense, they were still at square one. If only Skeptic's quirk made actual copies of people, like Twice, he could just clone that Midoriya kid and send that to Acquire One for All for him. As it was, he simply had to keep signing those paychecks and hope that All Might would cave in and give the quirk to one of his many operatives. Seatbelt lights, come on. I'm afraid my Wi-Fi will be cut shortly. Trust me, Rikia, things will be fine. With All for One's assistance, he'll be ready to receive his true quirk in no time at all. Before he could send a scathing retort the man's way, the camera feed cut and it took every ounce of his willpower not to smash the laptop into a fine metal powder. Growling, he snatched his phone and ran through his contacts, quickly finding the one he wanted and sending it a message. Keep me posted on whatever the doctor and All for One discuss. I need to know what to expect. A moment later, the pilot of Garaki's plane sent him a thumbs-up emoji before going offline. Closing his eyes, Rikia allowed himself a quick moment of silence and sent out a prayer. Hopefully, he wouldn't have to detonate the explosives he'd stashed in the plane on its return trip. The pilot seemed like a rather loyal soldier. Rikia honestly couldn't decide if he wanted the doctor to find All for One or not on his trip to the Chiba prefecture. Still, if it was his life or Rikia's, the choice wasn't difficult to make. If there was even a hint that that damn doctor intended to betray him, he'd put Garaki's assertion that only a nuclear warhead could kill All for One to the test. Idly, he sent yet another text to some of his operatives in Tartarus, searching for a status update on his Kill Kurogiri request. Still nothing. Either they were dead, or couldn't get a signal out of that metal death trap. Great. Raising the crystal glass to his mouth, the man frowned when he failed to sense the telltale burn of alcohol traveling down his throat, pulling it away. He couldn't help but be disappointed at the lack of liquid inside. He needed another drink. Or 20. Right, so X-ray vision, pretty straightforward. Not so good for me since I don't particularly care about looking at people's bones, but you know, decent for a doctor, yeah. The scraggly, wide-eyed man that was supposedly the head doctor jerkily nodded his head, his eyes momentarily flashing with a blue light. Izuku winced and held up his hand to block the man's sight, snapping his fingers in front of the man's face to make him blink. Oi, easy there, Professor. Your eyes are emitting actual, physical X-rays. And yes, before you say anything, I know that's an incredibly low amount of radiation, but I still don't like it being beamed in my face. His piece said. Izuku whirled around to the blonde receptionist, faltering for a moment at her chubby-cheeked similarities to a certain gravity-defying girl. Shima as sorry. Right, your Quirk, no offense, actual garbage. I am genuinely sorry you were born with that. While she was incredibly nervous, as evidenced by her near-uncontrolled trembling, the woman managed a small, shaky smile at Izuku. And no offense tea taken. Why you're not wrong. Satisfied, Izuku nodded and gestured towards the woman's hands, specifically her new iron-like fingernails. Iron nails were the closest thing I had to bone claws, sorry to say. However, as the former president of the Bone Breaking Club, I can say without a doubt you'll enjoy this a lot more. Izuku monologued, totally ignoring how half his spiel seemed to go over her head and focused on another staffer. Tanaka, black-haired guy with average features, worked here as a nurse. Utterly failed to insert an IV into Izuku's arm, which inadvertently saved him from entirely pointless surgery. Sterilizing spit, pretty self-explanatory. But you'll probably have to get a special license to use it in any capacity at work. Maybe don't go about telling anyone but your coworkers about it either. Yeah, some people may not like having their surgical scalpels dipped in saliva. In keeping with his own personal trend, Tanaka continued to sit at the break room table, near entirely motionless, only blinking once every couple minutes and doing it very, very slowly. Finally, Izuku turned to meet the glare of Akiko, the mother of the young girl he met earlier, and gave a quirk too. She was not happy to learn her daughter went and pestered Izuku for a quirk. Nor was she particularly enthusiastic to learn that he gave her one. She still didn't seem particularly enthusiastic about it now, come to think of it. I can give her another if it makes you feel better, Izuku offered, silently pleased when the Pinkette's eyes lit up like stars at the prospect of another quirk. Sadly, his peace offering offended the mother, as she greatly intensified the glare she was piercing Izuku with and forced him to actually shrink down in the chair he'd plopped himself in, an action that didn't go unnoticed by others. What makes you think I even want my daughter to have a quirk? The redhead spat out, crossing her arms angrily. While he wasn't sure if she could see it behind the mask on his face, Izuku sent her a sympathetic smile. Let's not kid ourselves here. She's quirkless. That's no way to live. Don't subject her to that when the solution's staring you in the face. A look of sheer indignation crossed her face before, much to the shock and horror of the other staffers, Akiko steadily marched up to Izuku and jammed her finger against his chest, the nail penetrating his skin and drawing a trail of blood. How dare you? I don't care who you are or what you've done, but you have no right to speak about my daughter as if she has a disease. We don't want her messed up, misplaced ideas of pity. You think you're all high and mighty just cause you have more than one quirk, eh? Well, newsflash, dipshit. She's living just fine without one. While the old Midoriya probably would have hidden under a table halfway through her rant, Izuku was currently able to withstand her fiery rage with remarkable aplomb thanks to his new mental disposition. And a quirk that essentially locked his facial features into place, plus a quirk that stopped him from sweating, used in tandem with another quirk that locked the rest of his muscles into place so he couldn't flinch back. Calmly, Izuku met the mother's gaze and stared at her sympathetically. I apologize if I seem a little rude about this, but you misunderstand. I completely agree. There is nothing wrong with your daughter, and your assertion that she doesn't need a quirk is absolutely correct. So, take it back, she grit out, removing her nail from his chest to point back at her daughter. No, Izuku responded, much to the little girl's visible relief. Akiko's eyebrows twitched dangerously, though Izuku was able to explain himself before she launched into another rant. You said earlier I gave your daughter a quirk out of pity. And you're partially correct, he started, raising both hands in surrender when the woman practically snarled at his statement. But it's not for the reasons you think. I do not pity her because I think she is sick, or is lacking something, or is defective. I pity her because despite the fact that there is absolutely no difference, on average, between her and other kids her age, she's going to be an outcast from society simply because her identification card says she's quirkless. Much to his relief, Akiko leaned back slightly at his assertion, staring at him with more curiosity than fury now. It might seem hard to believe, but I have personal experience with this. You see, Izuku started, only to trail off as he noticed, in the corner of the room, Arata frantically waving his arms around and making cutting motions with his hands. Everyone else in the room had relaxed marginally by this point after seeing their hot-headed colleague hadn't been turned into a red splatter upon the wall, and didn't notice the homeless man's gesticulations. I had a son, Izuku managed to spit out, guessing Haruki didn't want him spilling his story for one reason or another. He was rewarded by the sight of the old man visibly sagging in relief, releasing an entirely audible sigh that the rest of the room promptly ignored. You had a son? Shima asked, drawing far more information from his literally random word choice than there actually was. Izuku remained silent for a few seconds, cobbling together a story in his head when he realized something. He didn't really have to make up a story here at all. All he had to do was substitute his son for himself. Izuku shrugged and rested his head in his hands, sighing as he began his not-so-tall tale. Suicide. He was only 14, he stated, making more than one person flinch back at the word. Even Akiko's face softened a bit at the admission. As for the why, he was quirkless. Wait a second, the doctor interrupted, adopting a disbelieving expression. You mean to tell me that you, a man with hundreds of quirks, had a son without a single one? Izuku actually had an answer ready for that, as the nature of All for One's quirk was something he obsessed over during his time in Tartarus since he had literally nothing else to do, really. All the quirk's secrets, he knew them. Well, most of them. He had no idea souls were a package deal with quirks, but in his defense, he didn't have a single original quirk in his body at the time he was picking this stuff apart. All for One. Well, the quirk sort of cheats in that regard. See, I'm actually over 200 years old, he explained, drawing more than one gasp of surprise from his audience. Before they could ask redundant questions, though, Izuku held up his hand. One second. Let me explain first before questions that are inevitably going to be answered are asked here. Upon getting tentative nods of agreement, he continued. All right, so, firstly, I have a quirk called Life Force, which is the principal quirk keeping me alive. On its own, the quirk doubles a person's average lifespan, with the unfortunate downside of having a rather detrimental impact on one's own mobility. While I look young, I assure you, I walk like an old man unless I compensate with other quirks. However, that is not the sole life-extending quirk I own, and Life Force has basically multiplied the extended aging factor of the others, rather than simply adding on to it. Basically, it's boosted all my other anti-aging quirks to the point of supercharging them. Secondly, as some of you may have inferred, me being over 200 years old means I have been around since the dawn of quirks. This is entirely correct. My quirk, while undeniably powerful, is still a first-generation quirk. First-generation quirk users only had around an 8% chance of passing on their quirk factor to their offspring, as you may know. Several seconds of silence encompassed the room as they processed that, before Tanaka finally eked out, Biba, what about all your other quirks that you have? Izuku raised his hand and made a so-so gesture. The thing about my quirk is, it's technically a single quirk. When I get a new one, it's absorbed into the core of my quirk, not just stored alongside it. No matter how many I get, any test you run will simply say I have a single, individual quirk, even if, as you were doing the test, I was actively using 6 separate ones. Thus, despite having hundreds, my quirk factor is still that of a first-generation quirk user, which means I have a very low chance of passing anything on to my children. The room remained utterly silent as the staffers struggled to digest that information, with even Akiko having dropped down into a seat so she wouldn't have to stand up anymore. The only one who didn't seem affected was the redhead's daughter, who clearly had no idea what Izuku was talking about. Much to his own surprise, it was Arata who spoke up next, tentatively raising a hand. He must have noticed Izuku was explaining the actual mechanics of his quirk, since the man seemed genuinely invested in how the story would continue. So, what happened to your son? Again, Izuku shrugged and looked away. Things were fine for a time. I never planned on having kids, it was an accident really, but once he was born I fell into the role of a father as much as I could. My, work, he said while making quotation marks with his hands, kept me from living with them, but I still visited whenever I could, several times a year, for a couple of weeks each time. When our son was 4.5, his mother took him to the pediatrician to see why his quirk hadn't shown up, and it was revealed he had both joints in his toe. He was quirkless. I wanted to give him a quirk. I told his mother the truth about me, hoping for the best, and I was rejected. She kicked me out of their life, not that I blame her for it. It was the reasonable thing to do when you're told the man you love isn't actually 30-something, but 200 plus and can rip quirks out of others. She told me to stay away, told me to never give him a quirk. For the most part, I respected those wishes. I still watched my son from a distance, kept tabs on him occasionally, but I never gave him a quirk. Now, every day, I wish I did. I simply sat there and watched as his social life decayed to nothing and his friends abandoned him. I watched him follow around his childhood bully like a lost puppy because he actually acknowledged my son's existence, even if it was through beatings and insults. I watched the teachers of his school do literally nothing about it because he was quirkless, and watched his mother eat herself into obesity because no one could start a conversation with her without expressing their condolences for being saddled with such a burden. Everyone treated her like she was caring for a cripple. Izuku looked back to the room and focused on Akiko, who in turn was laser-focused on All for One. Her face, while still holding some disbelief, had noticeably softened upon hearing the sincerity in Izuku's tone. It wasn't that hard to fake, considering he was talking about himself. I listened as his childhood bully told him to kill himself, and then watched him trek home in sadness. Along the way, he met his favorite hero, his role model, All Might himself, and asked the man if he could be a hero. The deep, soul-crushing weight of All Might's words weighed down upon him, even all these years later. While it was entirely accurate to state that Izuku had forgiven Toshinori for those words, especially considering the chronic pain he was in basically all the damn time, those words were the catalyst for the biggest depressive slump he had ever fallen into. If Bakugo hadn't needed rescuing from that sludge monster on his way home, if there wasn't something there to distract him, I stood there and watched as All Might, Mr. You Can Do It himself, told my son that without a quirk, it was impossible to be a hero. I watched him tell my son to be realistic, and left him alone on a rooftop. And do you know what I did after that? He queried, casting his gaze around the room's now somber inhabitants. I left him there too. Shima, at least, had been moved to tears by his story, if the hands rubbing tears from her eyes were any indication. The doctor and Tanaka were looking down at the table, and Akiko couldn't find it in herself to look him in the eyes anymore. Only Haruki was still staring at Izuku with an expression of something he couldn't quite name. When I gave your daughter a quirk, I didn't do it because I thought something was wrong with her. I gave her a quirk because I know something is wrong with society. The majority always decides what is and isn't right. When I was born, having a quirk got you hunted down by the government for being a freak of nature. Now, having a quirk is expected. And if you don't, well, who cares about an ever-dwindling 20% of the population anyway, right? They'll be gone in another generation or two. Akiko still refused to meet his gaze, but eventually uttered a shaky, I understand, under her breath. Thank you. Truly, Izuku exhaled in relief, glad he was able to finally make her see. He meant what he said. Nothing was wrong with being quirkless, but that's not what everyone else thought. Just as he turned to address Haruki, the sound of her hand slamming down on the table drew his attention back to the redhead. But I still stand by what I said. I don't want her to have it. Mom, come on now, Akiko. Aki, no. No, she declared, once more meeting Izuku's now bewildered gaze head on. I don't think you're lying, and I understand where you're coming from. But I refuse to let my daughter have a quirk. How did you describe what you did? Ripped out of someone else. These quirks, all these powers, they weren't yours to take. You stole them. Then you probably killed them, since I'd never heard of people having their quirks stolen before, which means you silenced them. I refuse to accept your blood money, even if Arata's claim that you've had your personality swapped is true. There was so much to unpack in that statement Izuku didn't even know where to start. The borderline guilty look Haruki was sporting on his face filled him in pretty quickly though, which left him to deal with the blood money comment. Oh, well, don't worry. All of these quirks are just artificial copies of the real thing made in a lab anyways. No one here has a quirk I've stolen from anybody. As one, the entire room turned to stare at Izuku and collectively blinked at the same time. Izuku immediately nodded and held up his hands in surrender. All right, now that I said that out loud I realize it sounds pretty stupid. Oh okay, holding one of his hands out to the room, palm up, a glowing circle of white like a halo appeared above it, shimmering in the light. My own personal lie detector quirk, Izuku explained, getting a few tentative nods in response. I actually had this one given to me a while ago because the guy who had it couldn't use it as a cop since, if you lie, the circle shocks you. It's not particularly painful, but hurting a suspect in any way during interrogations is kind of a big no-no nowadays. Here, try it out, Haruki. While the man noticeably cringed at being volunteered, he still stepped forward to accept. So, how's I ta? Just insert your own hand through the glowing circle and tell a truth. Go for something simple, like your eye color. Hesitantly, the homeless man inserted his wrinkled hand into the glowing halo and relaxed slightly when nothing happened. And my eye color is brown. In response, the halo's white light immediately shifted to a vibrant, neon green. Now tell a lie. Again, something blatantly obvious. Like, you have 3 arms. Something along those lines. All right. I gots me 2 noses. The neon green instantly shifted to a venomous red, and an electrical charge shot out from the light and arced over Haruki's hands. Ack, he exclaimed, rapidly withdrawing his hand from the circle and inspecting his appendage. Tanaka pushed himself off his chair and went to inspect the appendage, but the homeless man waved him off. SL right. Just, esprised mes all. Wasn't worse than static, really. Now that we've established this functions, Izuku drew the attention back to himself, inserting his own hand into the once again white circle. My name is Izuku. Green light. My body is over 200 years old. Green light. I am wearing a shirt. Red light. Zap. The former greenette jerked his hand out momentarily and glanced at his appendage, before inserting it back into the circle. This quirk detects my lies just as it would anyone else in this room. and I am not using any other quirks to alter the results of this one. Green light. Inhaling a breath through his nose, Izuku pressed onwards. I am not the same man I was when I was sent to Tartarus. I do not plan on seeking revenge against All Might. I do not have plans to overthrow society, start an upheaval of any sort, nor will I revert back to my prior quirk-stealing ways. These quirks I have given you. They are all carbon copies of real quirks, created in a lab. The quirks you now possess have never been inside another body beyond my own. As the circle hovering above his palms remained green, he watched with a hint of satisfaction as the suspicion and fear slowly melted away from everyone's faces, being replaced with pure shock and dawning realization. You weren't kidding, Harada? Shima inquired, receiving a jerky nod from the similarly shocked man. Izuku had a feeling the pair of them were going to need to rehash the whole not actually all for one thing at a later date. Well, what's he gonna do about Hand Man? All eyes turned to Shima, who again shrank underneath the gazes, especially since Izuku himself was now amongst the stirrers. Hand Man? He questioned, genuinely not understanding what was being asked. Wordlessly, though shakily, Haruki turned around and marched towards the ancient television set upon the counter, smacking the power button. The second the screen flickered to life, Izuku felt his blood freeze as the still image of an older, even more bedraggled, and somehow more unhinged-looking Shigaraki appeared on screen. A newscaster was speaking empty words Izuku paid absolutely no mind to, his vision simply zeroing in on the headline. Tamura Shigaraki publicly searching for All for One. He just released a video not long ago. Someone Izuku didn't care to identify explained, says you gotta get Kurogiri so he can warp you to him. Said something about a doctor turning, as well. An internal war of sorts was raging inside Izuku, even as the voices of the newscaster and other staffers beginning to talk amongst themselves turned to little more than fading background noise. It wasn't his problem, but it was, because Shigaraki was the lead candidate for receiving All for One, or at the very least, knowing where the real quirk was stored. But he shouldn't go after him because he wasn't a damn hero, and literally anything he did would be vigilantism or borderline villainy, which he didn't want to do because that'd draw unnecessary attention to himself. If he acted too himself, everyone would get suspicious and wonder what was going on. But if he acted too villainous, no, scratch that. If he acted at all, people would realize he didn't just die in a hole somewhere, which, considering he wasn't in prison right now, might seem plausible. Yet at the same time, no, it was too dangerous. There was no way he cow. Is that? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it has just been confirmed that Shigaraki has managed to acquire several hostages, and is now threatening the warden of Tartarus with them. He has claimed that unless Kurogiri is freed from the still under siege prison, he will continually kill hostages every day until his demands are met. We now go to the Prime Minister of Japan, who has released a statement about I have to stop him, Izuku breathlessly explained, pushing himself out of the chair he'd sat in and immediately making his way towards the exit. Again and again, he proved to himself that old habits die hard. His mother used to tell himself that moving without thinking was gonna get him killed. And now that he was doing it yet again, he had to agree. He'd somehow managed to dodge fate after the truck. And now he was basically about to do the same damn thing again. Whoa, what are you gonna do about it in that state? The doctor exclaimed, pushing himself out of the chair and moving to intercept Izuku. You're literally carrying the 80-pound ventilator you're hooked up to just to keep breathing. The former Greenette gently pushed the man out of the way with a hand, noticing he didn't actually put any effort whatsoever into actually stopping him. I managed to break out of Tartarus without a ventilator. I can break in even easier with one. I've got a quirk that can warp people to me if they're nearby. I just need to get close enough to activate it. The plan, much like his plan to abduct Kai, was solid and basically foolproof. The only problem, however, look, I can appreciate what you're doing and all, but you're clearly exerting yourself too much already just by walking. You're sweating already, man. I can do this for hours, he calmly responded, finally exiting the room and following the pathway the exit signs laid out for him. This is stupid. Surely that plan isn't going to work to get you inside Tartarus, Shima exclaimed, moving to pace alongside his lethargic form. It got me out, it'll get me back in. Now that I can breathe, it'll be even easier. You can only breathe because of that giant machine. We don't have the tech to build that weird mask you wore in Kamino to keep you going. If security shoots that machine, you've lost it, Tanaka despaired, throwing up his hands in clear frustration. I can breathe without it for a couple of minutes, I'm sure. I can't let him kill anybody else. He's already done enough. Wait, please. Just as he finally made his way to the lobby and its boarded up windows and doors, the sound of Akiko actually sounding halfway concerned about his well-being stopped him in his tracks, and he turned around to see something that surprised him. Akiko was pushing a nondescript navy blue wheelchair forward with a fairly large bag sat upon the seat, a series of clear tubing and a distinct plastic mask sticking out of it. The woman marched it up to Izuku with a purpose and took several deep breaths, having obviously run to acquire the items before he charged out into the world. Portable oxygen tank, she breathlessly explained, holding up the bulky bag for Izuku to take. Won't do you as much good as the ventilator, but even basic supplementary oxygen helped you breathe when you first showed up. This is portable enough for you to tow around with you in this, she pointed to the wheelchair, which will help you negate your mobility issues. You've got a telekinesis quirk, right? Just use that to move the wheelchair instead of your arms. Midoriya stared at the out-of-breath redhead in surprise, also noticing all the other staffers surrounding her breathlessly awaiting his response. Hesitantly, Izuku took the proffered bag and gently set his own ventilator down on the lobby floor while sliding himself into the wheelchair. It pained him to admit he was relieved he wouldn't have to walk anywhere. Even as he unhooked the mask from his face to replace it with the portable oxygen's mask, he had to compliment the woman. Thank you. Using telekinesis to move the wheelchair will be far less taxing than walking. Rummaging his hand inside the bag, Izuku quickly found the tank's valve, which he in turn quickly twisted until the device started pumping oxygen into his damaged lungs. I'll bring you to where we first met. That'd be the best place to get back inside Tartarus, yeah? No, why you just need to get close, right? How close we talkin'? Tanaka nervously inquired, drawing various stairs to him. I have to be able to find them with my search quirk. So, at least a couple miles. Tanaka snapped his fingers and looked as though he'd just had an epiphany. Well, that's it then. The main bridge to Tartarus is closed, but the road to that bridge is still open since it connects to a major highway. We can just drive by in my van and you can warp him to you, right? Yes, that could work, Izuku exclaimed, turning his chair around to face the nurse. Even if it doesn't, I could simply tunnel underground from nearby and inch my way towards the complex until it does work. That's brilliant. Come on, I'm parked in the back lot. We've gotta hurry. I'm coming too. Is that really a good idea? Haruki, you ain't getting rid of me that easy. Tanaka, the rest of y'all, get yourselves home. We've been cooped up in this air clinic too long. And don't breathe a word of this to others, you hear? Tentative nods of agreement were shared all around before Tanaka suddenly took off down the hallways, with Izuku and Haruki moving to follow. Before he could get far though, Izuku, craning his head around to meet Akiko's stare, he once again found her face had hardened. If you end up helping Shigaraki instead of stopping him like you've said. She trailed off, allowing her threat to remain unspoken. The former brunette merely nodded in acknowledgement, silently approving, receiving another nod in return. Izuku wheeled around again and took off in the direction of Tanaka. Less than a single day to get Kurogiri before Shigaraki killed someone. And all because he busted his ass out of prison. He could do this. And Mr. All for one. Shima hesitantly inquired after his retreating form, forcing him to stop and turn around again. Yes, maybe why you could. He put a shirt on. Alright. Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification. So when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.